Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The radio crackled to life at 2:47 a.m., cutting through the humid August air that hung thick inside Unit 47 like a suffocating blanket. Officer Maya Chen had been nursing her third cup of coffee from Mel's all-night diner, the bitter liquid now lukewarm and leaving a metallic aftertaste that matched her mood. She'd been watching the empty streets of Riverside District through rain-streaked windshields for the past hour, counting the minutes until her shift would end at 7 a.m. 11 years on the force, 8 of them working graveyard shift, and she still felt that familiar knot in her stomach when dispatch broke the oppressive silence that settled over the city after midnight. It was 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday night that felt more like Wednesday morning, and the streets were as empty as a tomb. Unit 47. We have a domestic disturbance call at 1247 Oakwood Drive. Neighbor reports screaming and loud banging around 2:30 a.m., requesting welfare check. Complainant is Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez at 1249 Oakwood Drive. States she heard what sounded like furniture being thrown and a woman screaming for help. Maya grabbed the radio, her coffee sloshing onto the dashboard and spreading across the worn vinyl in a dark stain that would remind her of this night for weeks to come. Unit 47, responding to 1247 Oakwood Drive. ETA 4 minutes. The dispatcher's voice crackled back through the static. Copy, Unit 47. Be advised, this is the third call to this address in the past 6 months. Previous calls were unfounded. No answer at the door. No signs of disturbance. Complainant has been persistent. Maya acknowledged and pulled away from the curb where she'd been parked outside the 24-hour laundromat on 5th Street, one of the few businesses that stayed open all night in this part of town. The fluorescent lights inside cast an eerie blue glow onto the empty sidewalk, illuminating nothing but scattered newspapers and the occasional rat scurrying between storm drains. She'd been dreading a call like this all night. Something about the oppressive heat, the way the streetlights seemed dimmer than usual, the complete absence of foot traffic even in the areas that usually had some activity at this hour. It was the kind of night that made veteran cops nervous, the kind that ended badly more often than not. Maya had learned to trust those instincts over the years. They'd kept her alive through more dangerous situations than she cared to remember. The drive to Oakwood Drive took her through the heart of Riverside District's transitional zone, where gentrification efforts had stalled halfway through, leaving a patchwork of renovated properties next to houses that hadn't seen maintenance in decades. At this hour, everything looked abandoned and forgotten. Porch lights were few and far between, and the ones that did work cast harsh shadows that seemed to move in her peripheral vision. She passed the 24-hour gas station on Morrison Avenue, where the clerk sat behind bulletproof glass reading a paperback novel under fluorescent lights that flickered intermittently. A lone customer pumped gas into a beat-up sedan, glancing nervously at Maya's patrol car as she drove by. These were the night people. Insomniacs, shift workers, people with nowhere else to go who found themselves wandering the streets when the rest of the world slept. Oakwood Drive sat in the transitional zone between the gentrified downtown core and the rougher neighborhoods that sprawled toward the industrial district. Modest ranch houses from the 1960s, most well-maintained, but showing their age in sagging gutters and cracked driveways. Maya had responded to calls on this street before, usually noise complaints, occasionally domestic disputes that ended with someone spending the night in county lockup. Nothing that had prepared her for what she was about to encounter. The house at 1247 stood dark against the streetlight's amber glow, surrounded by a chain-link fence that had seen better days. No porch light, no interior lights visible through the windows. Maya parked the cruiser at the curb and sat for a moment, studying the property with the methodical attention to detail that had become second nature after 8 years of graveyard shifts. The front yard was overgrown, newspapers scattered on the walkway like fallen leaves. Some of them looked weeks old, their headlines faded and illegible from repeated exposure to rain and humidity. The neighbor's house to the right showed a single upstairs window glowing warmly. Probably Mrs. Vasquez, the complainant, watching from behind her curtains. Maya stepped out into the thick air, adjusting her duty belt. The Glock felt heavier tonight, though she couldn't explain why. Training and experience had taught her to trust those instincts, the ones that whispered warnings when something felt off. She'd learned that the graveyard shift amplified those instincts, made you more sensitive to the subtle wrongness that normal people missed. The humidity was oppressive, the kind that made your uniform stick to your skin and left you feeling like you were breathing underwater. Even at nearly 3 a.m., the temperature hadn't dropped below 80 degrees, and the air hung motionless between the houses like a physical presence. Maya could smell the industrial area 2 miles away. Chemicals and burning metal, and something else she'd never been able to identify. The walkway to the front door was cracked concrete, weeds pushing through like desperate fingers, reaching toward what little light filtered down from the street lamps. Maya approached slowly, her flashlight beam dancing across the front of the house. Paint peeling around the window frames, a screen door hanging slightly askew on its hinges. She could see inside through the main door's window, darkness and shapes that might have been furniture. She knocked firmly on the main door, 3 solid raps that echoed in the still air. Police, welfare check. Silence. Not even the sound of movement inside. No television or radio, no footsteps or voices. Just the oppressive quiet that seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it. Maya knocked again, harder this time, using the side of her fist. Police department, we received a call about a disturbance. Need to check on everyone's welfare. Still nothing. She tried the doorbell, but no chime sounded from inside. The button felt loose under her finger, like it hadn't been properly connected in years. Maya walked around to the side of the house, her flashlight revealing a narrow alley between this property and the next. No lights, no signs of life. The grass was tall enough to brush against her pants legs, and she could hear something small scurrying away from her footsteps. The backyard was accessible through a wooden gate that stood partially open, hanging on rusted hinges that looked like they'd given up trying to stay closed. Maya pushed it wider and stepped into the backyard, immediately noticing that the smell she'd detected from the street was stronger here. Something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in summer heat. She should wait for backup. Protocol dictated it, especially on domestic calls. Domestic disturbances were among the most dangerous calls police responded to. Emotions running high, people acting irrationally, weapons often involved. The statistics were sobering. More police officers were killed responding to domestic calls than any other type of incident. But something about the absolute silence, the way the house seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it, made her push forward. Domestic violence calls were time-sensitive. If someone inside was hurt, bleeding, unconscious, every minute mattered. She'd seen too many situations where waiting for backup had cost lives. Maya keyed her radio as she approached the back door. Dispatch, Unit 47. I'm at 1247 Oakwood Drive. House appears empty, but I'm going to check the rear entrance. If you don't hear from me in 10 minutes, send backup. Copy, Unit 47. Unit 23 is available if needed. The backyard was small and unkempt, surrounded by a privacy fence that blocked most of the light from neighboring houses. A rusty swing set sat in one corner, chains creaking slightly in the still air despite the absence of any breeze. The sound was rhythmic and unsettling, like a metronome keeping time for something Maya couldn't see. She approached the back door, noting that it was slightly ajar, not wide open, but definitely not closed properly. A thin line of darkness showed where it should have been flush against the frame. Maya tested the door handle with her flashlight hand. Unlocked. "Police," she called out. "The back door's open. I'm coming in to check on everyone's welfare." She pushed the door open with her flashlight hand, keeping her right hand free near her weapon. The hinges protested with a long, low squeal that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. The smell hit her immediately, something organic and wrong, mixed with the stale air of a house that had been closed up too long. The beam of her flashlight revealed a kitchen frozen in the middle of what looked like meal preparation. A pot of something congealed sat on the stove, its contents now covered with a film of mold that suggested it had been sitting for days or weeks. Plates were set out on a small dining table, food still on them but in various stages of decay. Milk in an open carton on the counter had separated and soured, creating a chunky yellow mass that had started to overflow onto the linoleum. "Hello? Police department? Is anyone home?" Maya moved through the kitchen carefully, avoiding disturbing anything while documenting what she saw. This wasn't abandonment. Someone had been in the middle of preparing a family dinner when something had interrupted them. The stove was still turned on under the pot, though the contents had long since boiled away and burned to the bottom. She entered what appeared to be a living room, her flashlight beam sweeping across furniture that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in weeks. Magazines fanned perfectly on a coffee table, remote controls lined up precisely on an end table. But dust had begun to settle on everything, and that smell was getting stronger with each step she took deeper into the house. Maya keyed her radio. "Dispatch, Unit 47. I'm inside 1247 Oakwood Drive. Property appears abandoned, but there are signs of recent habitation. Kitchen shows evidence of interrupted meal preparation. Requesting backup for thorough welfare check. Copy, Unit 47. Unit 23 is en route. ETA 6 minutes. 6 minutes felt like 6 hours in the suffocating silence of the house. Maya continued her sweep, moving down a narrow hallway lined with family photos. She paused to examine them with her flashlight. A middle-aged couple, probably the homeowners, with 2 children who looked to be in their early teens. Normal family pictures, vacation shots, school photos, Christmas morning scenes with presents under a tree, birthday parties with cake and candles. The kind of wholesome American family imagery that made what she was smelling even more disturbing. These weren't people who would just disappear, leave food rotting on their table and doors unlocked. Something had happened here, something that had interrupted a normal evening and left behind only questions and the increasingly oppressive stench that seemed to emanate from deeper in the house. The first bedroom was obviously the master. Bed unmade, clothes scattered on the floor. But not scattered like someone had left in a hurry, scattered like someone had been looking for something specific. Dresser drawers pulled open, contents spilled across the carpet. Jewelry box overturned. Papers from a home office desk spread across the bed. Maya's pulse quickened. This wasn't abandonment. This was a search. Someone had gone through this room methodically, looking for something valuable or important. The search had been thorough, but not violent. no furniture overturned, no obvious damage to the room itself. She moved to the closet, noting that several hangers were empty and clothes were missing from their usual spots. But not many clothes. Not like someone had packed for a long trip. Just select items. Things you might grab if you were leaving quickly, but trying not to attract attention. The second bedroom looked like it belonged to the teenage daughter. Pink walls, boy band posters, stuffed animals arranged on a perfectly made bed. Nothing disturbed here, which somehow made it more unsettling. If someone had searched the parents' room, why was this one untouched? Maya examined the desk and dresser. Everything in its place. Homework assignments stacked neatly, makeup and jewelry undisturbed. The third bedroom was clearly the son's. Sports equipment in one corner, video game posters on the walls, a computer setup that looked expensive and well-maintained. Like his sister's room, everything was neat and undisturbed. Maya was beginning to sense a pattern that made her stomach clench with dread. Someone had searched the parents' room but left the children's rooms alone. That suggested either that the searcher knew exactly what they were looking for and where to find it, or that something had interrupted the search before it could be completed. Neither possibility was encouraging. Maya checked the bathroom and found more evidence of interrupted routines. Toothbrushes in the holder, towels hanging on racks, medicine cabinet full of the usual family medications. But the shower was wet. Not just damp, but actually wet, as if someone had used it recently and the water hadn't had time to evaporate completely. She touched the shower walls with the back of her hand, still slightly warm. Someone had showered here within the last few hours, maybe even within the last hour. But the rest of the house suggested abandonment, stretching back days or weeks. Maya's radio crackled with Rodriguez's voice. Unit 47, Unit 23 is on scene. Where do you want me? Come in through the back door, Maya replied. House is unlocked and appears to have been searched. Still no sign of the residents, but something's not right here. She heard Rodriguez's footsteps on the back steps, then his voice calling out, "Police coming in through the back." His flashlight beam joined hers in the hallway. "Chen? You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Not yet," Maya said grimly. "But something happened here. Parents' room has been searched, kids' rooms are undisturbed, and someone used the shower recently even though the kitchen shows signs of abandonment going back weeks." Rodriguez was a 5-year veteran, solid and reliable, but still green enough to show nervousness in situations like this. Maya could see him trying to process the conflicting evidence, signs of both recent activity and long-term abandonment in the same house. "We need to check the basement," Maya said, though every instinct was telling her she didn't want to see what was down there. They found the basement door in the kitchen, a wooden door that opened onto a steep set of stairs descending into darkness. The smell that had been present throughout the house was much stronger here, rising from below like a physical presence. Maya started down first, Rodriguez following with his own flashlight. The wooden stairs creaked ominously under their weight, and the temperature dropped noticeably as they descended. The basement was unfinished. Concrete walls exposed ceiling joists, a few bare light bulbs hanging from electrical conduit. And the smell was overwhelming now, a thick, cloying stench that made Maya's eyes water and forced her to breathe through her mouth. They found them arranged in a semicircle on the basement floor, the family from the photographs. All 4 of them. They were seated in chairs that had been brought down from upstairs, the kitchen chairs Maya had seen around the dining table, the parents in the center, children on either side. All of them bound with rope, all of them long dead. The state of decomposition suggested they'd been there for at least a week, possibly longer. Maya stumbled backward into Rodriguez, her training warring with the horror of what she was seeing. She'd seen bodies before, traffic accidents and overdoses and the occasional homicide. But nothing like this. Nothing so deliberately staged, so carefully arranged. This wasn't random violence. This was something planned, calculated, ritualistic. Jesus Christ, Rodriguez whispered, his voice shaking. What the hell happened here? Maya forced herself to look more closely, documenting details while fighting the urge to run back up the stairs and out of the house. The family had been positioned to face each other. Parents looking at their children, children forced to look at their parents. Even in death, there was something deeply psychological about the arrangement. The binding technique was consistent across all 4 victims. Professional-grade rope, tied with what looked like military or nautical knots. No signs of struggle that she could see, which suggested they'd been incapacitated before being restrained. The children appeared peaceful, almost like they were sleeping, but the parents' faces showed the horror of whatever they'd witnessed before they died. She keyed her radio with shaking hands. Dispatch Unit 47. I need detectives and the coroner at 1247 Oakwood Drive immediately. Multiple deceased appears to be homicide. 4 victims appears to be the entire family. Also requesting additional units to establish a perimeter. Copy. Unit 47. Are you safe? Do you need immediate backup? Maya looked around the basement, her flashlight revealing more details she wished she couldn't see. Plastic sheeting spread on the floor beneath the chairs to catch blood and other fluids. Tools arranged on a workbench with military precision. Rope, duct tape, what looked like medical instruments. This hadn't been a crime of passion. It had been methodical, organized, planned down to the smallest detail. We're safe for now, she radioed back. But dispatch, I think we're looking at a serial offender. This scene shows extensive planning and organization. The killer spent significant time here. As she waited for backup to arrive, Maya forced herself to document what she could see without disturbing the crime scene. The basement had been prepared for this. Plastic sheeting, tools, even a video camera mounted on a tripod in one corner, pointed at the chairs where the family had been arranged. The psychological cruelty was almost worse than the physical violence. The killer had wanted the family to see each other die, had arranged them so their last sight would be their loved ones suffering. And he'd recorded it all, probably for later viewing. Rodriguez had moved to the far corner of the basement, trying to control his nausea. How long do you think they've been here? He asked. Maya examined the bodies more closely, noting the stages of decomposition and the condition of their clothing. At least a week, maybe longer. But remember, someone used that shower recently. The killer's been coming back here. The implication hung in the air between them. Whoever had done this hadn't just killed the family and left. They'd been returning to the scene, possibly to watch the recording, possibly to revisit what they'd done. The house hadn't been abandoned. It had been converted into a shrine to murder. Within an hour, the quiet residential street had been transformed into a crime scene. Detective Lisa Park arrived with the forensics team, followed by the coroner's van and additional patrol units to establish a perimeter. Maya found herself standing in the front yard, watching the controlled chaos of a major crime scene investigation unfold. The entire block had been cordoned off, and residents of neighboring houses were being interviewed by patrol officers. Mrs. Vasquez, the neighbor who had made the complaint, was speaking with Detective Park near the patrol cars. Maya could see her gesturing toward the house, explaining what she'd heard and when. Detective Park approached Maya with a notepad after finishing with Mrs. Vasquez. Park was a 15-year veteran of the detective division, known for her methodical approach to crime scenes and her ability to see patterns that others missed. Officer Chen, I need you to walk me through exactly what you found and in what order. Take your time and be as detailed as possible." Maya took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts. The basement scene was still vivid in her mind, but she needed to present the information professionally, without letting her emotional reaction color the facts. Dispatch received a call about a domestic disturbance at 2:47 a.m. Neighbor reported screaming and banging around 2:30 a.m. When I arrived at approximately 2:51 a.m., the house was dark with no response to knocking on the front door. She continued her report, detailing the progression through the house, the signs of disturbance in the master bedroom, the untouched children's rooms, the evidence of recent shower use, and finally, the horror in the basement. Detective Park took notes, occasionally asking for clarification on timing or positioning. "The staging bothers me," Park said when Maya finished. "This level of organization, the ritualistic positioning, the video camera, we're not dealing with someone who kills impulsively. This person plans extensively, probably watches potential victims for weeks or months before acting." The forensics team worked through the night, photographing and documenting every detail of the scene. Maya remained on site, partly for her report, but mostly because leaving felt like abandoning the family she'd found. They deserved better than to be discovered and forgotten, reduced to case numbers and evidence tags. As dawn approached, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink, the neighborhood began to wake up. Curious residents gathered at the police perimeter, coffee cups in hand, trying to understand what had happened to the quiet family who had lived at 1247 Oakwood Drive. Detective Park found Maya sitting in her patrol car as the morning shift officers began arriving to relieve the graveyard shift. "We've identified the family," she said. "Robert and Susan Martinez, children Alex and Sophia. Robert worked at the automotive plant. Susan was a substitute teacher. Married 15 years, no criminal history, no indication of financial troubles or domestic issues." "Random selection?" Maya asked. "That's what worries me most. If they were chosen randomly, if there's no connection between the killer and the victims, then this could happen to anyone. And given the level of organization we're seeing, the preparation, the ritualistic elements, I doubt this is his first time." The forensic evidence painted a disturbing picture as it was processed over the following days. The killer had entered through the back door using sophisticated lock-picking tools, suggesting professional training or extensive practice. He'd incapacitated the family using a fast-acting sedative, probably administered through the food that was found prepared in the kitchen. The rope work showed knowledge of advanced binding techniques, possibly military or maritime background. The positioning of the bodies indicated significant time spent at the scene after the murders. This wasn't someone who killed and fled, but someone who took time to arrange his victims according to some internal logic or compulsion. Most disturbing was the video camera. Analysis showed that it had been used multiple times, not just for this crime, but for previous recordings that had been erased. The killer was documenting his work, creating a library of murders that he could revisit whenever he wanted to relive the experience. The investigation consumed the next several weeks. Maya found herself working extended shifts, not because she was assigned to the case, but because she couldn't let it go. She drove past the Martinez house almost daily, watching as it transformed from an active crime scene to an empty shell with police tape fluttering in the wind like yellow funeral bunting. The case attracted media attention, bringing reporters and camera crews to the quiet residential street. Headlines screamed about the basement killer and family horror house, turning the Martinez family's tragedy into entertainment for people who would never have to see what Maya had seen in that basement. Maya found herself struggling with sleep, even during her off hours. The graveyard shift had always been challenging, the disruption to natural sleep patterns, the constant exposure to humanity's worst moments, the isolation that came from working when the rest of the world slept. But now, every call felt like it could be another basement full of bodies. She started requesting backup for all welfare checks, even ones that seemed routine. The other officers noticed her increased caution, but nobody questioned it. Word of the Martinez scene had spread through the department, and everyone was on edge. 3 weeks after the initial discovery, Detective Park called Maya at home during her off hours. Maya was lying on her couch, trying to catch a few hours of sleep before her next shift, when the phone rang. "We found another one," Park said without preamble. "Different part of town, but the signature is identical. Family of 3 this time. Same basement staging, same professional rope work, same video camera setup." Maya felt her blood turn to ice. "How long?" "Based on decomposition, probably killed 2 days after we found the Martinez family. While we were processing that scene, analyzing evidence, writing reports, he was already selecting his next victims. The second family was named Thompson, David and Jennifer Thompson, with their 8-year-old son, Michael. They lived in Riverside District's more affluent eastern section, about 4 miles from the Martinez house. David was an accountant with a small firm downtown. Jennifer worked part-time at a veterinary clinic. Again, no obvious connection to the killer, no reason they should have been targeted beyond random selection. Maya drove to the Thompson house immediately, even though she wasn't officially assigned to the case. She needed to see it, to understand if this was really the same killer, or if they were dealing with a copycat inspired by media coverage of the Martinez murders. The staging was nearly identical. Family arranged in chairs in the basement, positioned to face each other, bound with the same advanced rope techniques. But there were small differences that suggested evolution in the killer's methods. The sedative had been administered more efficiently, there were fewer signs of the search through personal belongings, and the camera positioning showed better understanding of angles and lighting. "He's learning," Detective Park explained during a briefing that now included FBI behavioral analysts. "Each crime is more refined than the last. He's treating these murders as practice sessions, perfecting his technique for some larger goal we haven't identified yet." The federal involvement brought resources but also pressure. The case was classified as a series of related homicides with the potential for additional victims. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit developed a profile of the killer, organized, methodical, likely with military or law enforcement background, between 30 and 45 years old, familiar with the local area, but not necessarily a long-term resident. Agent Sarah Walsh, the lead profiler, presented her analysis to the task force that had been assembled to coordinate the investigation. Maya sat in the back of the conference room, officially there to provide details about the crime scene discoveries, but really there because she couldn't stay away from the case. "This subject exhibits characteristics of an organized serial killer," Walsh explained, pointing to crime scene photographs projected on the conference room wall. "He plans extensively, brings his own tools and restraints, controls the crime scene completely. The staging suggests a psychological need to maintain power over his victims even after death." The photographs were difficult to look at, even in the clinical environment of a police briefing. Maya found herself focusing on details she'd missed during the initial crime scene processing. The precision of the rope work, the careful positioning of the chairs, the almost ritualistic arrangement of the bodies. "The family structure is important to him," Walsh continued. "He's not just killing individuals, he's destroying family units. The positioning forces family members to witness each other's deaths, which suggests deep-seated psychological trauma related to family dynamics in his own background." Maya raised her hand. "Agent Walsh, what about the video recordings?" Are we dealing with someone who's documenting these crimes for sale, or is it personal gratification? Based on the camera positioning and the lack of any evidence that recordings have been distributed, I believe this is personal. He's creating a library of murders that he can revisit. This gives him ongoing psychological satisfaction from crimes that would otherwise be over once the victims are dead. The briefing continued for 2 hours, covering every aspect of the crimes and the investigation. Maya learned that similar cases had been reported in other jurisdictions, not identical, but showing enough commonalities to suggest the same killer might have been active elsewhere before coming to their city. A database search had turned up 3 unsolved cases in nearby counties over the past 18 months. All involved families killed in their homes. All showed signs of extensive planning and organization. All had been staged in ways that suggested the same psychological profile. If these were connected, they were dealing with someone who had been killing for much longer than anyone had initially suspected. Maya left the briefing feeling both more informed and more disturbed. The scope of the investigation was expanding, but the killer remained completely unknown. Despite forensic evidence, behavioral analysis, and extensive canvassing of both crime scenes, they had no suspects and no clear direction for the investigation. She drove home through the early morning traffic, past commuters heading to normal jobs where the worst thing they might encounter was a difficult customer or a missed deadline. Maya envied them their ignorance of what she'd seen, their ability to sleep peacefully without wondering if their families were safe, their confidence that monsters were fictional characters rather than people who might live next door. The third victim was discovered by accident. Maya was working her regular graveyard shift patrol when she responded to a burglar alarm at a house in the Westfield neighborhood. Alarm company reported that the homeowner hadn't responded to their calls, and the alarm had been active for over 30 minutes without being reset. The house belonged to the Collins family, Mark and Patricia Collins with their 10-year-old daughter Emma. Mark worked as a manager at a local furniture store. Patricia was a nurse at the children's hospital. When Maya arrived at the house, she found the front door standing open and the alarm still blaring. She called for backup before entering, having learned her lesson from the Martinez house. Rodriguez arrived within 5 minutes, and together they approached the open front door. "Collins family?" Maya called out. "Police department, your alarm is going off." No response, but the house was filled with light and showed no signs of disturbance from the outside. Maya and Rodriguez entered carefully, weapons drawn, following standard procedure for a possible burglary in progress. They found the family in the basement. The same staging, the same careful positioning, the same video camera setup. But this time, they'd arrived while the killer was still in the house. Maya heard footsteps upstairs as she and Rodriguez were examining the basement scene. Heavy footsteps, moving deliberately rather than trying to escape. Someone who knew the house was surrounded by police and wasn't concerned about being caught. "Rodriguez, call for backup," Maya whispered into her radio. "Suspect still on premises." She started back up the basement stairs, her weapon drawn and her heart hammering against her ribs. 8 years of graveyard shift patrol had prepared her for a lot of situations, but confronting a serial killer in a house full of bodies wasn't one of them. The footsteps had stopped. Maya reached the top of the basement stairs and peered into the kitchen, using her flashlight to cut through the shadows. Nothing visible, but she could sense a presence somewhere in the house. Rodriguez joined her, covering the hallway while Maya moved toward the living room. They worked together, clearing each room methodically, but the house felt empty now. Whoever had been upstairs was gone. They found evidence of his presence in the master bedroom. Clothes laid out on the bed as if he'd been changing outfits, a duffel bag with additional rope and tools, and most chilling, a notebook filled with details about other families. names, addresses, daily routines, floor plans of houses. The Collins family had been just one entry in a book that contained information on dozens of potential victims. Maya flipped through the notebook while Rodriguez secured the scene. Page after page of meticulous surveillance notes, photographs taken from outside houses, work schedules, and school pickup times. The level of preparation was staggering. This wasn't someone who selected victims randomly, but someone who studied them for weeks or months before acting. One entry caught her attention: her own address. Her name, her work schedule, details about her apartment building and the times she typically came and went. The killer had been watching her, probably since she'd discovered the Martinez family. Maya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Rodriguez," she called out. "We need to get out of here now." She showed him the notebook entry with her information. Rodriguez's face went pale as he read the details. Not just about Maya, but about several other officers who had worked the Martinez and Thompson crime scenes. "He's targeting cops," Rodriguez said. "Anyone who's been involved in the investigation." They evacuated the house immediately and called in the FBI task force. Agent Walsh arrived within an hour, bringing a full forensics team and additional security for all personnel who had worked on the case. The notebook was a treasure trove of intelligence about the killer's methods and future plans. In addition to Maya's information, it contained details about Detective Park, Agent Walsh herself, and several other officers. The killer wasn't just documenting his crimes. He was planning to eliminate anyone who might be able to stop him. "This changes everything," Walsh explained during an emergency briefing. "We're not just hunting a killer, we're being hunted by him. Everyone involved in this investigation is now a potential target." Maya was assigned protective detail and moved to a safe house until the killer could be apprehended. She found herself sharing a cramped apartment with Detective Park and two other officers, all of them under 24-hour protection while the investigation continued. The safe house was in a nondescript suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where nothing interesting ever happened and neighbors minded their own business. Maya felt like a prisoner, unable to work her regular shift, unable to go home, unable to do anything except wait while other officers tried to solve a case she'd started by walking into the Martinez house. The breakthrough came from forensic analysis of the notebook. The paper was traced to a specific manufacturer, the ink to a particular brand of pen, and most importantly, fingerprints were found on several pages. The killer had been careful about evidence at the crime scenes, but he'd been careless with his planning materials. The fingerprints matched someone already in the system: Derek Morrison, a corrections officer at the county jail who had been on duty during the booking of several suspects from previous crime scenes. Morrison had access to police procedures, familiarity with investigation techniques, and most importantly, he'd been present when evidence from the Martinez and Thompson cases had been discussed in the jail. Maya knew Morrison by reputation rather than personal interaction. He worked day shift at the jail, had been employed there for 12 years, and had a reputation for being thorough and professional. His personnel file showed no disciplinary actions, solid performance reviews, and commendations for preventing several escape attempts and maintaining order during difficult situations. But when Detective Park ran Morrison's work schedule against the timeline of the murders, a disturbing pattern emerged. He'd requested time off during the estimated periods for all three killings, claiming family emergencies or personal illness. His tactical boots were the exact brand and model that had left prints at the Thompson house. And most damning, he'd been present in the jail when suspects from all three crime scenes had been processed, giving him access to details about the investigation that hadn't been released to the public. The surveillance began immediately: Morrison's apartment, his vehicle, his off-duty activities. The FBI behavioral analyst predicted that if Morrison was their killer, he wouldn't be able to resist continuing his surveillance of potential victims or returning to previous crime scenes. They were right. On a Thursday night, just 5 days after the Collins family had been discovered, surveillance teams spotted Morrison's personal vehicle parked outside Maya's apartment building. He'd been there for over 3 hours, using binoculars to observe the building and taking notes in another notebook. Maya watched the surveillance footage from the safe house, feeling violated and angry. Morrison had been studying her home, learning her routines, planning what he would do to her when he finally made his move. "We can't let him continue," Maya said to Agent Walsh. "He's escalating. The families were practiced, but now he's targeting law enforcement. He won't stop until we stop him." Walsh nodded grimly. "We're setting up a controlled operation. Morrison doesn't know we've identified him yet, so we're going to use that advantage. We'll let him think he's hunting you while we're actually hunting him." The plan was risky, but necessary. Maya would return to her regular graveyard shift patrol, but with extensive backup and surveillance. Morrison would be allowed to continue his stalking behavior until he made a move that would give them grounds for arrest and enough evidence to ensure conviction. Maya felt exposed and vulnerable during her first night back on patrol. Every shadow seemed to hide Morrison's presence. Every radio call could be him trying to lure her into an ambush. But she was also angry, and that anger gave her focus. This monster had killed 3 families, terrorized an entire city, and made her afraid in her own home. It was time to end it. The bait worked faster than anyone expected. 2 nights after Maya returned to patrol, Morrison made contact. Her radio crackled with a call that wasn't from dispatch, a voice she didn't recognize, speaking calmly and deliberately. "Unit 47, this is your friend from Oakwood Drive. I think it's time we met in person." Maya's blood ran cold, but her training kicked in. She keyed her radio to respond while simultaneously triggering the panic button that would alert the surveillance team. "I don't know who this is, but you're on a police frequency. Identify yourself immediately." Morrison's voice came back, still calm and controlled. "Officer Chen, you know exactly who this is. You've been in my work, seen my art. I think you appreciate the craftsmanship, the attention to detail. Most people don't understand, but I think you might." Agent Walsh's voice crackled through Maya's earpiece. The surveillance team was using a different frequency to coordinate without Morrison overhearing. "Maya, we're tracking the transmission. He's mobile, probably using a police scanner to monitor your frequency. Keep him talking." Maya took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice steady. "Morrison, I know you're listening. If you want to talk, let's do it properly. Come to the station, we'll sit down and discuss this like professionals." Morrison laughed, a sound that made Maya's skin crawl. "Oh, I don't think so. Too many people, too much noise. I prefer intimate settings, private conversations, like the ones I had with the Martinez family and the Thompsons and the Collins family." "Why them?" Maya asked, genuinely wanting to understand. "What did those families do to deserve what you did to them?" "Deserve?" Morrison's voice carried a note of surprise, as if the question had never occurred to him. "Officer Chen, this isn't about deserving anything. This is about art, about creating something beautiful and permanent. Those families are immortal now, preserved forever in the moment of their greatest truth." Maya felt sick, but she kept him talking while the surveillance team closed in on his location. "What truth is that, Morrison?" "That family is an illusion. That love is temporary. That everything people think they can count on will eventually be taken away. I just accelerate the process, make it clean and honest instead of letting it rot slowly over years. Agent Walsh's voice in her ear. We've got a location. He's in the industrial district near the old Morrison foundry. Units are moving to intercept, but he's mobile. Stay on the radio with him. Maya continued the conversation, trying to keep Morrison from realizing he was being tracked. And the video recordings? What are those for? Documentation. Proof that I was right about them. You should see how quickly love disappears when real fear sets in. How fast parents will beg for their own lives while their children watch. It's educational. Maya's anger flared, but she forced herself to stay calm. What about me, Morrison? What truth do you think you'll find? Oh, you're different, Officer Chen. You're not family, you're competition. You've seen my work, studied it, maybe even admired it a little bit, but you're trying to stop me and that can't be allowed. You're not art, you're just business. The radio went silent. Morrison had either turned off his equipment or figured out that he was being tracked. Maya sat in her patrol car, hands shaking slightly, waiting for updates from the surveillance team. Agent Walsh's voice crackled through her earpiece. We lost him. His vehicle was found abandoned near the foundry, but he's on foot now. All units are searching the area, but he could be anywhere. Maya looked around at the empty streets of her patrol sector. Morrison knew these streets as well as she did, probably better. He'd been watching, learning, preparing for this moment. And now he was out there somewhere, hunting her, while she sat exposed in a patrol car under streetlights that seemed dimmer than usual. Her radio crackled again, but this time it was dispatch with a routine call. Unit 47, we have a report of suspicious activity at 1247 Oakwood Drive. Neighbor reports seeing lights in the abandoned house. Maya's heart stopped. The Martinez house. Morrison was going back to where it all started. Dispatch, Unit 47 responding. Be advised this location is connected to an ongoing investigation. I'll need backup before entering the premises. But even as she said it, Maya knew she couldn't wait for backup. Morrison was at the Martinez house for a reason, probably setting up an ambush or preparing for one final act of violence. Every minute she delayed gave him more time to prepare. She drove to Oakwood Drive with her emergency lights off, approaching the house from the opposite direction than she had on that first night weeks ago. The street looked different now. Media attention had brought curious visitors, and the house had become a morbid tourist attraction. But at 3:30 a.m., it was as empty and silent as it had been during her original welfare check. The house at 1247 looked exactly as it had when the crime scene had been released. Windows boarded up, yellow police tape still clinging to the porch railing, yard overgrown and neglected. But there was a faint light visible through one of the boarded windows, confirming the neighbor's report. Maya parked 3 blocks away and approached on foot, using the same route she'd taken during her original investigation. The back gate was open again, creaking in the slight breeze that had picked up since midnight. The smell was gone. The bodies had been removed and the house professionally cleaned, but Maya's memory supplied the stench anyway. The back door was ajar, just as it had been on that first night. But this time, Maya knew what she was walking into. She keyed her radio quietly. Dispatch. Unit 47 is at 1247 Oakwood Drive. Suspect vehicle is not visible, but there are lights inside the house. I'm going to attempt visual confirmation before entering. Agent Walsh's voice came through her earpiece. Maya, do not enter that house alone. We're 5 minutes out, just wait for backup. But Maya could see Morrison through the kitchen window. He was in the basement again, moving around with a flashlight, arranging something she couldn't quite make out. He'd come back to the scene of his first crime, the place where Maya had discovered his work and started the investigation that led to his identification. She entered through the back door, moving as quietly as possible across the kitchen floor. The house felt different now. Not just empty, but hollow, like all the life had been drained out of it permanently. Maya could hear Morrison moving around in the basement, talking to himself in a low voice she couldn't quite understand. At the top of the basement stairs, she paused to listen. Morrison was speaking more clearly now, and Maya realized he was talking to the chairs, the same chairs where the Martinez family had died. "I brought her back," he was saying. "The one who found you first. She understood what I was trying to show everyone. She saw the truth in what happened here." Maya started down the basement stairs, her weapon drawn and her flashlight off to avoid giving away her position. The stairs creaked under her weight, but Morrison was too absorbed in his monologue to notice. "Family is an illusion," Morrison continued. "Love is temporary, but art is forever. What I created here will be remembered long after everyone forgets your names, your faces, your pathetic little lives." Maya reached the bottom of the stairs and could see Morrison clearly now. He'd arranged 4 new chairs in the same positions where the Martinez family had died. He'd brought rope, the same type he'd used for all his murders, and he'd set up his video camera again, pointed at the chairs. He was preparing to recreate the Martinez murders, but this time with Maya as the sole victim. "Officer Chen," Morrison said without turning around. "I wondered how long it would take you to find me here. This is where it started, where you first saw my work. It's fitting that it should end here too." Maya kept her weapon trained on Morrison while reaching for her radio with her free hand. "Morrison, you're under arrest for the murders of the Martinez family, the Thompson family, and the Collins family. Put your hands where I can see them and step away from the chairs." Morrison turned slowly, and Maya could see his face clearly for the first time. He looked ordinary, middle-aged, slightly overweight, the kind of person you'd pass on the street without a second glance. But his eyes were completely cold, empty of any emotion except a calm satisfaction. "I don't think so, Officer Chen. You see, you're part of the art now. The police officer who discovered my first masterpiece, come back to become part of the final installation. It's poetic, really." Morrison moved toward the workbench where he'd arranged his tools, but Maya's voice stopped him. "Don't move, Morrison. I will shoot you if you take another step." "No, you won't," Morrison said confidently. "You're a good cop, Officer Chen. You follow rules, procedures. You won't shoot an unarmed suspect who isn't presenting an immediate threat. It's not in your training." He was right, and they both knew it. Morrison hadn't made any aggressive moves toward Maya, hadn't threatened her directly. Under normal circumstances, police procedure would require her to wait for backup, to attempt arrest through verbal commands and physical restraint. But these weren't normal circumstances. "You killed 3 families," Maya said. 9 people total, including 3 children. You've been planning to kill me and other officers. You're not just a suspect, you're a terrorist." Morrison smiled, the expression somehow more disturbing than his earlier calm demeanor. "Terrorist, I like that. Yes, I suppose I am terrorizing people, making them confront truths they'd rather ignore, making them realize that their comfortable little lives can be taken away at any moment." He took another step toward the workbench, and Maya could see rope and duct tape arranged in neat rows. "But you're wrong about one thing, Officer Chen. I'm not planning to kill you. I'm planning to preserve you, to make you part of something greater than yourself." Maya's finger tightened on the trigger, but Morrison was right. He hadn't presented an immediate threat. She was a police officer, not a vigilante. She had to follow procedure even when dealing with a monster. Step away from the bench, Morrison. Put your hands behind your head and get on your knees. Instead, Morrison picked up a length of rope and held it up for Maya to see. Do you know how long it takes to strangle someone with rope this thickness? About 4 minutes if you do it right. Long enough for the brain to understand what's happening. Short enough to prevent permanent damage to the vocal cords. The screaming stays nice and clear for the recording. Maya's radio crackled with Agent Walsh's voice. All units, suspect is confirmed to be in the basement of 1247 Oakwood Drive. Officer Chen is inside with the suspect. Do not approach until further orders. Morrison heard the radio and smiled wider. Backup is coming, but they won't get here in time, Officer Chen. They'll find you arranged in those chairs, along with a recording of our conversation. Evidence that you came here alone, against orders, and got yourself killed by underestimating me. He took another step toward Maya, the rope still in his hands. You can shoot me now, but then you'll never understand why I did what I did. You'll never know the truth about those families, about what they really were underneath all their pretense and lies. Maya kept her weapon trained on Morrison while keying her radio. Dispatch, Unit 47 has the suspect in custody in the basement of 1247 Oakwood Drive. Suspect is armed with rope and making threats. I need immediate backup. Morrison laughed. Armed with rope? Officer Chen, that's not going to justify shooting me. Rope isn't a deadly weapon unless I'm actually using it to attack you. And I'm not attacking you. I'm just talking. Just sharing my philosophy about families and truth in art. He was right again, and Maya felt trapped by the very procedures that were supposed to protect both officers and suspects. Morrison understood the system well enough to manipulate it, to put her in a position where she couldn't act until it was too late. Tell me about the families, Maya said, trying to keep Morrison talking while backup arrived. What truth did you think you were revealing? Morrison's eyes lit up with enthusiasm, like a teacher who had finally found an interested student. The Martinez family. Perfect suburban family, right? Robert worked hard. Susan took care of the kids. Everyone loved each other. But did you know Robert was having an affair? That Susan knew about it and was planning to leave him? That their perfect family was already dead? They just hadn't admitted it yet? Maya kept her weapon steady while processing this information. How do you know that? I watched them for months before I acted. I saw Robert sneaking around, saw Susan crying when she thought no one was looking, saw the kids picking up on their parents' tension. That family was a lie, Officer Chen. I just made the lie visible. What about the Thompson family? Morrison moved closer to the chairs, still carrying the rope. David Thompson was embezzling money from his accounting firm. Jennifer knew about it, was helping him hide it. They were planning to disappear, abandon their son, and start new lives somewhere else. Some family, right? I saved that little boy from being abandoned by showing him what his parents really were. Maya felt sick, but she kept Morrison talking. And the Collins family? Mark Collins was abusing his daughter. Patricia knew and did nothing because she was afraid of losing her comfortable life. They were all keeping secrets, all pretending to be something they weren't. I gave them honesty, Officer Chen. I made them face the truth about themselves before they died. Maya realized what Morrison was doing. He was justifying his murders by revealing the victims' secrets, their human flaws and failures. In his twisted mind, killing them was an act of righteousness, exposing hypocrisy and forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths. Those were still human beings, Maya said. Whatever problems they had, whatever mistakes they made, they didn't deserve to die for them. Morrison's smile faded, replaced by the cold emptiness she'd seen earlier. "Everyone deserves to die, Officer Chen. Some people just deserve it more than others." Those families were living lies, infecting their children with dishonesty and pretense. I cleaned up the mess they were making of the world. He took another step forward, now close enough to reach Maya if he moved quickly. "And you, Officer Chen, what secrets are you hiding? What lies are you telling yourself about who you really are?" Maya's backup chose that moment to announce their arrival, voices calling from upstairs as multiple officers entered the house. Morrison's head snapped toward the basement stairs, and Maya saw her opportunity. "Derek Morrison, you're under arrest," she said firmly. "Drop the rope and put your hands behind your head." Morrison looked back at Maya, then at the chairs he'd arranged, then at the video camera he'd positioned to record whatever he'd planned to do. For a moment, Maya thought he might surrender, accept that his killing spree was over. Instead, he lunged toward her with the rope. Maya fired twice, center mass, dropping Morrison before he could reach her. He fell backward into one of the chairs he'd arranged, the rope still clutched in his hands, blood spreading across the plastic sheeting he'd laid out for his final victim. Agent Walsh and Detective Park reached the basement first, weapons drawn, assessing the scene quickly and professionally. Morrison was unconscious but still breathing, and Maya was standing over him with her weapon still trained on his motionless form. "Officer Chen, are you injured?" Agent Walsh asked. Maya shook her head, though she felt like she'd been hit by a truck. "He's alive. He confessed to all 3 murders, gave the details about the family's personal lives. He's been watching them for months before killing them." Detective Park was examining Morrison's arranged chairs and video camera setup. "He was planning to recreate the Martinez murders with you as the victim. This whole scene is identical to what we found here originally." Paramedics arrived and began working on Morrison, who had regained consciousness but was in critical condition from the gunshot wounds. As they loaded him onto a stretcher, he looked directly at Maya. "You'll never understand," he whispered through the oxygen mask they'd placed over his face. "You'll never see the beauty in what I created. You're just another small mind trying to preserve comfortable lies." Maya watched them carry Morrison up the basement stairs and out of the house. She'd ended his killing spree, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he'd accomplished something by bringing her back to this basement. He'd forced her to kill him in the same place where his victims had died, making her part of his twisted narrative whether she wanted to be or not. The investigation continued for months as prosecutors built their case against Morrison. His survival meant a trial, and Maya would have to testify about everything she'd seen and heard. The notebook found at the Collins house provided evidence of his surveillance activities and future plans, while the basement scene at the Martinez house gave prosecutors the attempted murder charge they needed to ensure life imprisonment. Morrison's trial began 8 months after Maya shot him in the Martinez basement. By then, he'd recovered enough to participate in his own defense, though he'd been left partially paralyzed by her bullets. He sat in his wheelchair in the defendant's chair, showing no emotion as prosecutors presented evidence of his crimes. Maya testified for 3 days, recounting her discovery of each crime scene, her investigation of the evidence, and the final confrontation in the basement. Morrison watched her throughout her testimony, never speaking but occasionally taking notes on a legal pad. During his own testimony, Morrison remained calm and articulate, showing no remorse for the murders but expressing frustration that he hadn't been able to complete his work with additional victims. He described each family's flaws and secrets in detail, maintaining that he'd performed a public service by exposing their hypocrisy. "I regret that Officer Chen interrupted my final installation," Morrison said during his closing statement. The Martinez house basement was meant to be a permanent exhibition, a place where people could come to understand the truth about family structures and social pretense. Instead, it's been reduced to just another crime scene. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Morrison was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus additional consecutive sentences for attempted murder of a police officer and weapons violations. Maya attended the sentencing hearing, watching from the gallery as Morrison was wheeled out of the courtroom in shackles. He turned to look at her one final time before disappearing through the doors, and she could swear she saw him mouth the words, "Thank you." The case officially closed with Morrison's conviction, but its impact on Maya and everyone involved lasted much longer. She'd requested and received a transfer to day shift, something she'd never considered in 11. Comfortable in darkness looked different in daylight. The rhythm of calls was different. More traffic incidents, fewer domestics, different types of crime altogether. The community of officers was different too. Less tight-knit than the graveyard shift crew, more formal and procedural. But what bothered Maya most was the loss of the brotherhood she'd built with other graveyard shift officers. The late-night solidarity at Mel's all-night diner, the understanding that came from working when the rest of the world slept, the shared experience of seeing humanity at its most vulnerable hours. All of that was gone, replaced by daylight routine and normal hour camaraderie that felt hollow by comparison. 6 months after Morrison's conviction, Maya received a letter forwarded through the department. It was from Patricia Collins, the woman whose family Morrison had been surveilling when he was arrested. "Officer Chen," the letter read, "I wanted to thank you for your work on the Morrison case. Detective Park told me that your investigation and quick response probably saved our lives. I know that discovering those crime scenes must have been traumatic, and I wanted you to know that your dedication made a difference for our family. My daughter Emma is now 11 years old and thriving in school. She has nightmares sometimes about what might have happened, but she also talks about wanting to be a police officer when she grows up, so she can help protect other families. Thank you for showing her that there are good people in law enforcement who will fight to keep families safe." Maya kept the letter in her patrol car, reading it whenever she felt overwhelmed by the cynicism that had crept into her worldview since the Morrison case. It reminded her that, despite the horror of what she'd discovered, despite the psychological damage of confronting someone like Morrison, the work she did still mattered. The case had taught her that evil could hide behind the most ordinary facades, that monsters could be colleagues and neighbors, that the people trusted to protect society sometimes needed protection from their own protectors. But it had also shown her the importance of vigilance, of following instincts even when they led to uncomfortable truths, and of never assuming that anyone was above suspicion. On quiet afternoons during her day shift patrol, Maya sometimes drove past the houses where the Martinez, Thompson, and Collins families had lived. The Martinez and Thompson houses had been sold to new families. Children's toys now visible in yards where crime scene tape had once fluttered, normal family life resuming in places where horror had temporarily taken root. The Collins house was unchanged, its family intact and grateful to be alive. Sometimes Maya would see Emma Collins playing in the backyard or walking to school, and she would remember Morrison's notebook with its detailed surveillance notes about the little girl's daily routine. But Maya never forgot the lesson learned in those basement rooms, that the most dangerous criminals aren't always strangers lurking in alleys or prowling dark streets. Sometimes they're the people who work in the same building, who understand police procedures well enough to exploit them, who use their knowledge of the system to hunt the people sworn to protect society. The graveyard shift continued without her, staffed by officers she trusted, but would never view with quite the same unquestioning faith. And somewhere in a maximum security federal prison, Derek Morrison served his life sentence in a wheelchair, probably planning murders he would never be able to commit, organizing crimes he would never be able to execute. Maya had moved on to day shift, but the shadows of those basement crime scenes followed her. A permanent reminder that in police work, the most important investigations are sometimes the ones that force you to question everything you thought you knew about the people around you. The Morrison case had closed with his conviction, but its impact on everyone involved would last much longer. It changed how Maya approached her work, how she interacted with colleagues, how she evaluated threats and assessed danger. Most importantly, it reinforced her commitment to the victims, the Martinez family, the Thompson family, and the Collins family, who had been spared only by careful police work, good instincts, and a willingness to act when action was required. In the end, that's what police work had always been about, standing between ordinary families and the darkness that threatened to consume them. Maya had learned that sometimes that darkness came from unexpected sources, wore familiar faces, and hid behind badges and uniforms. But the commitment to protection remained the same. Whether working nights or days in uniform or plainclothes, the job was still about keeping the monsters at bay, even when those monsters looked just like everyone else. Officer Sarah Kowalski had been working graveyard shifts for 12 years, but she'd never gotten used to the way the city transformed after midnight. During daylight hours, metropolitan areas buzzed with legitimate commerce, families going about their daily routines, the normal rhythms of civilized society. But when darkness fell and most decent people locked their doors and went to sleep, a different world emerged from the shadows. The predators came out at night. It was 1:23 a.m. on October 15, 2023, when Sarah received the call that would change everything she thought she knew about the human trafficking operations in her city. She was sitting in Unit 52 outside Mickey's 24-hour diner on Industrial Boulevard, nursing her fourth cup of coffee and watching the empty streets for any sign of unusual activity. The radio crackled with dispatch's voice, cutting through the oppressive silence that had settled over her patrol sector like a burial shroud. Unit 52, we have a suspicious vehicle report at the old Riverside Motel on Highway 9. Caller reports seeing multiple individuals being moved from vehicles to motel rooms under what appeared to be coercive circumstances. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she acknowledged the call and started her engine. The Riverside Motel had been on the department's radar for months as a possible location for illegal activities, but they'd never been able to develop enough evidence for a search warrant. The motel sat on the edge of the city limits, technically within their jurisdiction, but isolated enough that whatever happened there rarely attracted attention from law-abiding citizens. She'd driven past the Riverside dozens of times during her graveyard shifts, noting the unusual patterns of activity that seemed to peak between midnight and dawn. Cars with out-of-state license plates arriving at odd hours. Rooms that stayed occupied for days but showed no signs of normal motel guest activity. Windows that remained covered with heavy curtains even during daylight hours. But tonight would be different. Tonight, someone had finally called in a complaint specific enough to justify a welfare check. Sarah drove through the empty streets toward Highway 9, her emergency lights off, but her senses heightened to maximum alertness. 12 years of graveyard shift patrol had taught her to trust her instincts about when situations were more dangerous than they appeared on the surface. Something about this call felt different from the routine suspicious activity reports she handled most nights. The Riverside Motel had been built sometime in the 1960s, a single-story strip of 20 rooms arranged in an L shape around a parking lot that had seen better decades. During daylight hours, it looked merely shabby and outdated. But at night, under the flickering neon sign that advertised vacancy in letters that had been missing bulbs for years, It took on a more sinister appearance. Sarah parked her patrol car at the entrance to the parking lot and studied the motel for several minutes before approaching. She could see lights in approximately half of the rooms, but the curtains were drawn tight enough that she couldn't determine how many people might be inside or what they were doing. 3 vehicles were parked in front of occupied rooms: a white panel van with no windows, a dark sedan with tinted windows, and a pickup truck that looked like it had been driven hard for many miles. All 3 vehicles had license plates from different states, which was unusual for a motel in their city that typically catered to local guests seeking hourly rates rather than overnight accommodations. Sarah keyed her radio. "Dispatch, Unit 52 is on scene at the Riverside Motel. I count 3 vehicles and multiple occupied rooms. Requesting backup before I make contact with any occupants." "Copy. Unit 52. Unit 31 is en route. ETA 8 minutes. 8 minutes felt like an eternity when Sarah was looking at a situation that could involve human trafficking. If people were being held against their will in those motel rooms, every minute of delay could mean additional suffering, or the possibility that victims would be moved to another location before police could intervene. But protocol existed for good reasons, especially when dealing with situations that could involve organized criminal operations. Human traffickers were typically well-armed, desperate, and willing to use extreme violence to protect their operations. A single patrol officer approaching alone would be at a significant disadvantage if the situation turned hostile. Sarah remained in her patrol car and continued her observation of the motel, documenting everything she could see while waiting for backup. The white panel van particularly concerned her. It was the type of vehicle commonly used for transporting multiple people who couldn't or wouldn't travel voluntarily. At 1:47 a.m., she observed movement between 2 of the occupied rooms. A large man in dark clothing emerged from room 7 and walked quickly to room 12, knocking on the door in what appeared to be a coded pattern. The door opened immediately, suggesting that someone had been watching for his arrival. The man disappeared into room 12 for approximately 3 minutes, then emerged and returned to room 7 using the same quick, furtive movements. Sarah noted that he appeared to be carrying something small in his hands, possibly money, drugs, or documents, but she couldn't determine exactly what from her position in the parking lot. Unit 31 arrived at 1:51 a.m., driven by Officer Mike Chen, a 7-year veteran who had worked with Sarah on several complex cases during their overlapping graveyard shifts. Chen parked his patrol car next to Sarah's and approached her driver's window. "What have we got?" Chen asked quietly. Sarah briefed him on her observations, including the suspicious vehicle activity and the movement between rooms she'd witnessed. Chen studied the motel layout and the positioning of the vehicles, his expression growing more serious as he processed the information. "This has all the hallmarks of a trafficking operation," Chen said. "Multiple rooms, out-of-state vehicles, people moving between locations in coordinated patterns. We need to approach this very carefully." Sarah agreed, but she was also conscious of the possibility that victims might be suffering while they developed their tactical approach. "Mike, what if there are people in those rooms who need immediate help? What if we're looking at a time-sensitive situation where delay could cost lives?" Chen considered this carefully. "Let's do a preliminary welfare check on one of the rooms, just to assess the situation. If we encounter evidence of trafficking or people in immediate danger, we call for specialized units and treat it as a major operation. If it turns out to be legitimate motel guests, we apologize for the disturbance and move on." They decided to approach room 7, where Sarah had observed the man in dark clothing. It was positioned at the corner of the L-shaped building, which would give them better visibility of the entire motel complex and multiple escape routes if the situation became dangerous. Sarah and Chen approached the room on foot, their flashlights off, but their hands positioned near their weapons. The parking lot was quiet except for the distant hum of highway traffic and the intermittent buzz of the failing neon sign. Sarah knocked on the door of room 7, using the standard police approach, firm but not aggressive, loud enough to be heard inside, but not so loud as to alert occupants of other rooms. "Police, we'd like to speak with you about a noise complaint." The response was immediate silence, not the silence of people who were asleep or absent, but the silence of people who were suddenly very alert and trying not to make any sound that would indicate their presence. Sarah knocked again, harder this time. "Police, we know you're in there. We just need to speak with you for a few minutes." This time, she could hear hushed voices inside the room, speaking in what sounded like a foreign language. The voices sounded stressed, possibly frightened, and there were more of them than would be expected for typical motel guests. Chen positioned himself to one side of the door while Sarah continued trying to make contact with whoever was inside. "This is Officer Kowalski with the city police. We're not here to cause trouble, but we need to check on everyone's welfare. Please open the door." The door opened approximately 3 inches, held by a security chain, and Sarah could see part of a man's face through the gap. He appeared to be middle-aged, with dark hair and clothing, and his visible eye showed the kind of wariness that came from extensive experience with law enforcement. "Officers," the man said, his English heavily accented but clearly understandable. "Is there a problem? We are not making noise. We are sleeping." Sarah could see enough of the room's interior to note that there were definitely multiple people inside, and the space looked more crowded than would be normal for paying motel guests. She could also detect an odd smell coming from the room. Not drugs or alcohol, but something organic and unpleasant that suggested poor sanitation or too many people in too small a space. "Sir, we received a complaint about suspicious activity in this area. We just need to make sure everyone is safe and accounted for. Can you open the door so we can speak properly?" The man's visible eye darted nervously, and Sarah could hear more hushed conversation from inside the room. "Officers, we are tired. We are traveling. We do not want to be disturbed." Chen stepped closer to the door. "Sir, we understand you're tired, but we have a responsibility to check on people's welfare when we receive certain types of complaints. This will just take a few minutes, and then we'll leave you alone." The man closed the door completely, and Sarah could hear animated discussion in the foreign language from inside the room. The conversation sounded heated, with multiple voices contributing opinions or concerns. Sarah keyed her radio quietly. "Dispatch, Unit 52 and Unit 31 are at the Riverside Motel. We have a room with multiple occupants who are reluctant to cooperate with a welfare check. The situation feels suspicious, but we don't have grounds for forced entry at this time." "Copy, Units 52 and 31. Do you need additional backup?" Sarah looked at Chen, who nodded grimly. "Dispatch, yes. Send at least 2 more units and have them stage at the highway entrance. Also, can you run the license plates on the vehicles in the parking lot? We have a white panel van, dark sedan, and pickup truck, all with out-of-state plates." While they waited for backup and the license plate information, Sarah and Chen maintained their position outside room 7. The conversation inside had quieted, but they could still hear movement and occasional whispered exchanges. At 2:08 a.m., Sarah's radio crackled with information from dispatch. "Unit 52, we have results on those license plates. The white panel van is registered to a corporation in Nevada that appears to be defunct. The sedan is registered to an individual in Texas who reported it stolen 3 weeks ago. The pickup truck registration comes back to a man in Oklahoma who has multiple arrests for human trafficking and forced labor violations. Sarah felt her stomach clench as the pieces began falling into place. This wasn't just suspicious activity. They were looking at an active human trafficking operation, possibly involving forced labor or sexual exploitation. The reluctance of the room occupants to cooperate with police suddenly made sense in a much darker context. Chen keyed his radio. "Dispatch, based on the license plate information and the occupant's behavior, we believe we're looking at a possible human trafficking situation. Request immediate response from specialized units and a supervisor. Copy, Unit 31. Detective units and a sergeant are en route. Also dispatching additional patrol units to establish a perimeter around the motel." Sarah realized that what had started as a routine suspicious activity call was escalating into a major operation that could involve dozens of victims and multiple criminal suspects. But with that realization came the weight of responsibility. If there were people being held against their will in those motel rooms, the next few hours would determine whether they gained their freedom or disappeared forever into the criminal underworld. The door to room 7 opened again, this time without the security chain. The same man appeared, but now Sarah could see that he was accompanied by 2 other men and at least 3 women. All of them looked exhausted, frightened, and underfed. "Officers," the man said, "we will cooperate. But please, we are afraid. We do not want trouble." Sarah studied the group visible in the doorway, noting details that supported her growing suspicions about their situation. The women appeared to be much younger than the men, possibly teenagers. Their clothing was mismatched and appeared to have been worn for several days without washing. Most significantly, they all showed the same expression of fearful resignation that Sarah had learned to recognize in victims of human trafficking. "Sir, can you step outside so we can talk privately?" Sarah asked the man who appeared to be the spokesman for the group. The man looked back at the others, then stepped outside and closed the door behind him. In the harsh light from the motel's security fixtures, Sarah could see that he was older than she'd initially estimated, probably in his 50s, with calloused hands and the weathered appearance of someone who had spent years doing manual labor. "What's your name?" Sarah asked. "Miguel," the man replied. "Miguel Santos." "Miguel, are you and the people in that room here voluntarily? Are you free to leave if you want to?" Miguel's expression became guarded, and Sarah could see him calculating his response. "We are working. We travel for work. Sometimes we stay in motels." Chen stepped closer. "What kind of work, Miguel?" "Construction, farm work, different jobs." Sarah had interviewed enough trafficking victims to recognize the rehearsed quality of Miguel's answers. These were responses that had been drilled into him and the others, designed to deflect police attention without providing information that could be used against their traffickers. "Miguel, where are your identification documents? Do you have passports, driver's licenses, anything that proves who you are?" For the first time, Miguel's carefully controlled expression cracked slightly. "The boss, he keeps our papers, for safety, so they don't get lost." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Traffickers commonly confiscated their victims' identification documents as a method of control, making it nearly impossible for victims to travel independently or seek help from authorities. Without papers, the victims became completely dependent on their traffickers for everything: food, shelter, transportation, even basic identification. Additional police units began arriving, taking positions around the motel perimeter as supervisors and specialized investigators prepared to coordinate what was clearly going to be a complex operation. Sarah could see Sergeant Rodriguez approaching, along with Detective Martinez from the Human Trafficking Task Force. "Miguel," Sarah said quietly, I want you to understand something. You're not in trouble. The people with you are not in trouble. But if someone is forcing you to work without pay, or keeping your documents, or threatening you or your family, we can help you. That's why we're here." Miguel looked around at the increasing police presence, then back at Sarah. She could see that he was struggling with a decision that could have life-or-death consequences for himself and the people in the motel room. "Officer," Miguel said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "if I tell you the truth, what happens to my family in Guatemala? What happens to the others who are not here tonight?" Sarah realized that Miguel's question revealed the true scope of what they were dealing with. This wasn't just about the people in the motel rooms, it was about a network that extended across international borders, involving families in other countries who were being used as leverage to ensure compliance from the trafficking victims. Sergeant Rodriguez joined them, having been briefed by Chen on the situation. "Miguel, my name is Sergeant Rodriguez. I've worked on cases like this before. I understand you're scared, and I understand you have good reasons to be scared. But right now, you have a chance to help us stop the people who are hurting you and others. This might be the only chance you get." Miguel studied Rodriguez's face, perhaps seeing something in the sergeant's expression that suggested genuine concern, rather than the aggressive interrogation techniques that traffickers had probably warned him to expect from police. "How many people are in the rooms?" Rodriguez asked gently. Miguel hesitated, then said, 17, in 3 rooms. Some are very sick. The young girls, they have been hurt." Sarah felt sick as the implications of Miguel's words sank in. 17 people crammed into 3 motel rooms, some of them ill, some of them injured, all of them controlled by traffickers who were willing to use violence to maintain their operation. Detective Martinez approached the group, introducing herself as a specialist in human trafficking cases. "Miguel, we're going to need to go room by room and make sure everyone is safe. Can you help us do that without anyone getting hurt?" Miguel nodded slowly. "The boss, he is not here tonight. He comes back in the morning with more work. But his men, they have guns. They watch from room 12. Rodriguez immediately keyed his radio to alert all units about armed suspects in room 12. The tactical situation had just become significantly more complex, with potential hostages in multiple locations and armed traffickers who would likely resist arrest violently. "Miguel, how many men with guns?" Martinez asked. 2, maybe 3. They take turns watching, the others sleep." Sarah realized that they were looking at a carefully organized criminal operation with security protocols and shift schedules. These weren't opportunistic criminals. They were professionals who had established procedures for managing their human cargo and protecting their investment. Rodriguez coordinated with the other responding units to establish a tactical plan for securing all 3 rooms simultaneously. The priority was protecting the victims, but they also needed to arrest the traffickers and preserve evidence that could be used to dismantle the larger network. At 2:35 a.m., the coordinated raid began. Sarah and Chen were assigned to secure Room 7 with Miguel's assistance, while other teams moved on Rooms 12 and 15 simultaneously. The goal was to prevent the traffickers from harming victims or destroying evidence while ensuring that all 17 people could be safely extracted from the motel. Miguel opened the door to Room 7 and called out in Spanish, explaining to the occupants that police were there to help them, not hurt them. Sarah could hear crying from inside the room, along with voices speaking rapidly in what sounded like multiple languages. When Sarah entered Room 7, she was unprepared for what she found. The room was designed for 2 guests, but it housed 7 people ranging in age from what appeared to be 16 to 60. They were sleeping on mattresses placed on the floor, with a few blankets shared among them. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, fear, and desperation. But what struck Sarah most forcefully was the absolute terror in their eyes when they saw her uniform. These people had been conditioned to fear police as much as they feared their traffickers, probably through a combination of threats and actual experiences of corruption or violence from law enforcement in their home countries. Sarah holstered her weapon and raised her hands to show that she meant no harm. "Miguel, can you please explain to them that we're here to help, that they're not in trouble?" Miguel spoke to the group in Spanish, then translated some responses back to Sarah. "They want to know if you're going to send them back. They're afraid of being deported. Some of them paid everything they had to get here, and they were told they would have good jobs and safe places to live." Sarah realized that these victims were caught in an impossible situation. They had been lured to the United States with promises of legitimate work and better lives, only to find themselves enslaved by traffickers who used their immigration status as another form of control. Even rescue by police represented a threat because it could lead to deportation back to the dangerous conditions they had tried to escape. "Miguel, tell them that our first priority is making sure they're safe and healthy. Tell them that there are organizations that help people in their situation, and that we're going to connect them with people who speak their languages and understand what they've been through." As Miguel translated, Sarah could see some of the fear in their faces being replaced by cautious hope. But she also realized that what happened in the next few hours would determine whether these people viewed law enforcement as protectors or as another threat to be avoided. Her radio crackled with updates from the other teams. "Room 12 secured. 3 suspects in custody, no shots fired. Room 15 secured, 7 additional victims, no suspects present." Sarah felt a wave of relief that the tactical phase of the operation had been completed without violence, but she knew that the real work was just beginning. 17 trafficking victims would need medical attention, psychological support, legal assistance, and protection from retaliation by the criminal network that had been controlling their lives. Over the next 6 hours, Sarah participated in what became one of the largest human trafficking rescue operations in the city's history. The victims were transported to a secure facility where they could receive medical care and begin the long process of recovery and legal documentation. Miguel and 3 other victims agreed to cooperate with the investigation, providing information about the trafficking network that led to additional raids and arrests over the following weeks. Sarah learned that the operation they had disrupted was just one node in a much larger network that moved people across multiple states, using them for forced labor in agriculture, construction, and service industries. The motel raid revealed the sophistication of modern human trafficking operations. The criminals involved used social media to recruit victims with false promises of legitimate employment. They had established relationships with corrupt officials in multiple countries to facilitate illegal border crossings. They maintained safe houses and transportation networks that could move people hundreds of miles within hours if law enforcement got too close. But what disturbed Sarah most was learning about the psychological control methods that made physical restraints unnecessary. The traffickers used debt bondage, threats against family members, confiscation of documents, and deliberate isolation to create a mental prison that was often more effective than locked doors or chains. The 17 people rescued from the Riverside Motel represented just a tiny fraction of the estimated millions of people trapped in modern slavery worldwide. Sarah realized that she had glimpsed something vast and horrifying, a shadow economy built on human suffering that operated parallel to legitimate society. In the days following the raid, Sarah found herself struggling with the knowledge of what she had seen. The graveyard shift had always exposed her to humanity's worst impulses, but human trafficking represented a level of systematic cruelty that challenged her faith in human decency. She attended the court proceedings where the traffickers were prosecuted, listening to testimony from victims who described years of abuse, exploitation, and degradation. Some victims had been forced to work 18-hour days in agricultural fields without pay. Others had been sexually exploited in massage parlors and private residences. All of them had been cut off from their families and communities, living in constant fear of violence if they tried to escape. Miguel became one of the key witnesses in the prosecution, despite the personal risk involved in testifying against his former captors. During his testimony, he described how he had been recruited in Guatemala with promises of construction work that would pay enough money to support his family and eventually bring them to the United States. Instead, he had been forced to work in various locations across 3 states, never receiving the wages he had been promised, and always being told that he owed more money for transportation, housing, and food than he could ever repay. His identification documents had been confiscated immediately upon arrival, making him completely dependent on his traffickers for everything. I thought many times about trying to escape, Miguel testified. But they told me that if I ran away, they would hurt my family in Guatemala. They showed me pictures of my wife and children, and they said they knew where my family lived. I believed them because I had seen what they did to others who tried to leave. Sarah realized that the traffickers had created a psychological prison that was virtually escape-proof. Even when victims had opportunities to flee, they were paralyzed by fear for their families and by the knowledge that they had no resources or support systems that would help them survive as undocumented immigrants in a foreign country. The prosecution resulted in significant prison sentences for the 3 traffickers arrested at the motel, but Sarah knew that the larger network would adapt and continue operating. The demand for cheap labor and sexual services created a market that criminal organizations would always try to fill, regardless of law enforcement efforts. 6 months after the motel raid, Sarah received an update on the 17 people who had been rescued. Most had been connected with social services and legal assistance that helped them apply for special visas available to human trafficking victims. Some had been reunited with family members in the United States. Others had chosen to return to their home countries with assistance from international organizations. Miguel had become an advocate for trafficking victims, working with law enforcement and social service agencies to help identify and rescue other people trapped in similar situations. His family had been successfully brought to the United States under a special visa program, and he was working legally in construction while learning English and helping his children adjust to American schools. But Sarah also learned that the rescue had come too late for some of the victims. 2 of the women had suffered permanent health damage from the abuse they had endured. One of the teenagers had attempted suicide while in protective custody, overwhelmed by trauma and uncertainty about her future. These outcomes reinforced Sarah's understanding that human trafficking caused damage that extended far beyond the immediate physical exploitation. Victims carried psychological scars that could take years or decades to heal, if they ever healed completely. The motel where the rescue had taken place was closed permanently, but Sarah knew that similar operations were likely taking place in other locations throughout the city. The traffickers had simply adapted their methods, using different venues and more sophisticated security measures to avoid detection. Sarah began volunteering with anti-trafficking organizations during her off-duty hours, using her law enforcement experience to help train other officers in recognizing signs of human trafficking. She learned that patrol officers were often the first responders who encountered trafficking victims, but that many officers lacked the training to recognize the subtle indicators that distinguished trafficking from other crimes. Trafficking victims, she learned, often didn't look like the stereotypical image of kidnapped and chained slaves. They might appear to be free, walking around in public, even interacting normally with customers or employers. But they were controlled through psychological manipulation, debt bondage, threats against families, and other coercive methods that were invisible to casual observers. Sarah developed training materials that helped officers recognize signs like multiple people sharing cramped living accommodations. Workers couldn't speak for themselves or seemed afraid of authority figures, people who didn't have control of their identification documents, and businesses that seemed to operate outside normal patterns of commerce. But she also learned about the limitations of law enforcement approaches to human trafficking. Arresting traffickers and rescuing victims was important, but it did nothing to address the underlying factors that made people vulnerable to trafficking in the first place. Poverty, lack of economic opportunities, corruption in their home countries, and immigration, policies that forced people to seek dangerous and illegal methods of crossing borders. The graveyard shift continued to expose Sarah to the darkest aspects of human behavior, but her experience with the trafficking case had given her a new perspective on the nature of evil. She realized that some of the worst crimes weren't committed by obviously violent criminals, but by people who treated other human beings as commodities to be bought, sold, and exploited for profit. 2 years after the motel raid, Sarah was promoted to sergeant and assigned to supervise other graveyard shift officers. She used her position to ensure that patrol officers received training in human trafficking recognition and response, and she established protocols for coordinating with specialized units when trafficking was suspected. She also maintained contact with Miguel and several other survivors from the motel rescue, learning about their ongoing struggles and successes as they rebuilt their lives. Their experiences reinforced her understanding that recovery from trafficking was a long and difficult process that required sustained support from multiple agencies and organizations. Miguel's children had adapted well to American schools and were excelling academically. His wife had found work as a seamstress and was learning English. Miguel himself had started a small construction company that employed other immigrants, both documented and undocumented, paying fair wages and treating workers with dignity. Officer Kowalski, Miguel told her during one of their conversations, "What you and the other police did that night, it gave us back our lives. But more than that, it gave us back our hope." Before the rescue, I had started to believe that some people were just meant to suffer, that there was no justice in the world. You showed me that there are still people who will fight for what is right. Sarah was moved by Miguel's words, but she also felt the weight of responsibility they represented. She realized that law enforcement officers working graveyard shifts were often the only barrier between predators and their victims, the only hope for people who had been forgotten or abandoned by the rest of society. The case had taught her that evil often wore ordinary faces and operated through seemingly legitimate businesses. Human traffickers weren't necessarily violent criminals who looked the part. They were often people who appeared respectable, who had families and communities that had no idea what they were involved in. But the case had also shown her the resilience of human beings and their capacity for recovery, even after experiencing unimaginable trauma. The 17 people rescued from the motel had been broken by their experiences, but they had also demonstrated incredible strength in rebuilding their lives and helping others who were trapped in similar situations. Sarah continued working graveyard shifts, knowing that somewhere in the city, other trafficking operations were exploiting vulnerable people who deserved rescue and justice. She remained vigilant for the subtle signs that might indicate another motel, warehouse, or residential location where modern slaves were being held. The night shift had taught her that the darkest hours before dawn were when both the worst and the best of humanity revealed themselves. Predators emerged from the shadows to hunt the vulnerable, but dedicated officers and advocates also worked tirelessly to protect the innocent and fight for justice. In the end, Sarah's experience with the trafficking case reinforced her commitment to graveyard shift policing. She understood that the work was difficult, dangerous, and often thankless, but she also knew that it was necessary. Someone had to stand watch during the dark hours when evil thought it could operate without consequence. Someone had to be the light that guided victims back to safety and hope. The motel raid had lasted only a few hours, but its impact continued to ripple outward through the lives of everyone it had touched. 17 people had been given a chance at freedom and dignity. 3 traffickers had been removed from the criminal network that had enslaved them, and a patrol officer had learned that sometimes the most important arrests happened during routine calls that initially seemed no different from dozens of others. Sarah never forgot the lesson of that October night, that human trafficking wasn't something that happened only in distant countries or to people who were fundamentally different from herself. It was happening in her city, in her patrol sector, to people who deserved protection and justice, regardless of their immigration status or the circumstances that had made them vulnerable to exploitation. The graveyard shift continued, night after night, with officers patrolling empty streets and responding to calls that might be routine or might change everything. Sarah approached, each call with the knowledge that behind the ordinary facades of motels, warehouses, and residential buildings, modern slavery might be destroying human lives that could still be saved if someone cared enough to look closely and act courageously. In the darkness before dawn, when most people slept safely in their beds, Sarah and officers like her maintained the thin blue line between civilization and the predators who would exploit the vulnerable if given the opportunity. It was dangerous work, often heartbreaking work, but it was also essential work that could mean the difference between freedom and slavery for people who had no other advocates. The night harvest of human souls continued in cities across the world, but so did the efforts of those who refused to let evil operate without opposition. Sarah had learned that one officer, one call, one moment of courage could save lives and restore hope to people who had thought both were lost forever. That knowledge sustained her through the long, dark hours of the graveyard shift, giving meaning to work that might otherwise have seemed futile in the face of such overwhelming criminal enterprises. She had seen the worst that humans could do to each other, but she had also seen the best, the capacity for ordinary people to risk their own safety to protect the strangers, to fight for justice even when the odds seemed impossible, and to maintain hope even in the darkest circumstances. The graveyard shift was more than just a work schedule. It was a calling to serve as a guardian against the forces that threatened human dignity and freedom. Sarah answered that calling every night, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, people were counting on officers like her to stand between them and those who would treat them as property rather than human beings deserving of respect and protection. But the Riverside Motel case was just the beginning of what would become the most challenging period of Sarah's career. 6 months after the initial rescue, she began noticing patterns in other calls that suggested the trafficking network was adapting and expanding rather than retreating in response to law enforcement pressure. It started with seemingly unrelated incidents during her graveyard shifts. A welfare check at an apartment complex where residents reported hearing crying from a unit that was supposed to be vacant. A traffic stop where the driver became unusually nervous when asked about his passengers. 3 young women who wouldn't make eye contact and claimed not to speak English. A noise complaint at a massage parlor that was operating at 3 a.m. with heavy curtains covering all the windows. Individually, these incidents might have been explained as routine police work. Welfare checks that turned up nothing suspicious. Traffic stops involving nervous but legitimate travelers. Businesses operating outside normal hours for legitimate reasons. But, taken together, they suggested a coordinated effort to establish new operations in Sarah's patrol sector. Sarah began documenting everything, creating detailed reports that went beyond the basic requirements for patrol officers. She noted license plate numbers, descriptions of individuals, addresses where suspicious activity was observed, and patterns of movement that suggested organized rather than random criminal activity. Her supervisor, Sergeant Martinez, initially viewed Sarah's detailed reporting as excessive thoroughness rather than evidence of larger criminal enterprises. "Kowalski, you're writing novels instead of police reports," Martinez said during one of their weekly meetings. "Unless you have specific evidence of crimes being committed, we can't justify the overtime hours you're spending on these investigations." But Sarah couldn't ignore what she was seeing. Her experience with the trafficking rescue had trained her to recognize subtle indicators that other officers might dismiss as inconsequential. The way certain individuals moved through her patrol sector with the confidence of people who knew they were protected. The businesses that operated at unusual hours with customers who arrived and departed according to specific schedules. The residential properties where lights were visible at all hours, but no normal family activity could be observed. She began working her own time, using her days off to conduct surveillance and gather intelligence that might not be available during her official patrol hours. Sarah would park her personal vehicle in locations that provided good observation points and document activity patterns that suggested organized criminal operations. What she discovered was more extensive and sophisticated than anything revealed by the motel raid. The trafficking network had indeed adapted to law enforcement pressure, but rather than reducing their operations, they had expanded them and made them more difficult to detect. Instead of concentrating victims in obvious locations like isolated motels, they were distributing them across multiple sites that appeared to be legitimate businesses or residential properties. Sarah identified at least 12 locations in her patrol sector where suspicious activity suggested possible trafficking operations. These included apartment complexes where too many people seemed to be living in individual units, restaurants that stayed open unusually late with heavy foot traffic that didn't match normal dining patterns, and service businesses that seemed to have more employees than their operations could reasonably support. The network had also become more sophisticated in their security measures. Sarah observed counter-surveillance activities, people whose jobs seemed to be watching for police attention and alerting others when law enforcement was in the area. She noticed that certain vehicles would appear in multiple locations, apparently serving as mobile command posts for coordinating the movement of people and materials. Most disturbing was the evidence that the network had developed relationships with people in positions of authority who could provide advance warning of law enforcement operations. Sarah began noticing that locations she had identified as suspicious would suddenly cease their unusual activities shortly before scheduled police actions, suggesting that someone with access to operational information was tipping off the criminals. Sarah realized that she was potentially looking at corruption within her own department, a possibility that challenged everything she believed about law enforcement and her colleagues. The idea that fellow officers might be protecting human traffickers in exchange for money was almost too horrible to consider, but the evidence was difficult to explain any other way. She began conducting her own investigation more carefully, limiting her communications about trafficking-related matters to secure channels and avoiding certain personnel who might have access to operational planning. Sarah felt increasingly isolated, carrying knowledge that could expose a major criminal network, but unable to trust the very systems that were supposed to support her investigative efforts. 3 months into her unofficial investigation, Sarah made a discovery that confirmed her worst fears about corruption within the department. She was conducting surveillance on a warehouse facility that had been showing suspicious activity patterns when she observed Detective Raymond Collins arriving at the location in his personal vehicle. Collins was a 15-year veteran of the department with an exemplary record and a reputation for thorough investigative work. He was also someone who had access to information about ongoing trafficking investigations. Sarah watched through binoculars as Collins met with 2 men outside the warehouse, engaged in what appeared to be a serious conversation, and then accepted what looked like an envelope before returning to his vehicle. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes, but it was conducted with the kind of caution that suggested all parties understood they were engaged in illegal activity. Sarah felt sick as the implications of what she had witnessed began to sink in. Detective Collins wasn't just corrupt. He was actively protecting a criminal network that enslaved human beings for profit. His position within the department gave him access to intelligence about trafficking investigations, information that he was apparently selling to help criminals avoid arrest and continue their operations. But Sarah also realized that confronting Collins directly or reporting what she had seen through normal channels could be dangerous. If Collins was working with traffickers, he might have relationships with other corrupt officials who could neutralize any investigation before it began. Sarah could find herself facing retaliation not just from criminals, but from within her own department. She decided to continue her investigation independently while carefully documenting everything she observed. Sarah began carrying a small digital camera during her surveillance activities, capturing photographic evidence of meetings, license plate numbers, and other details that could be used to build a case against the corrupt network. The scope of what she was uncovering grew larger with each night of surveillance. The trafficking operation wasn't just exploiting foreign nationals who had been smuggled into the country. It was also targeting vulnerable American citizens, including runaway teenagers, homeless individuals, and people struggling with addiction who could be easily controlled and exploited. Sarah observed what appeared to be recruitment activities taking place in areas where vulnerable people congregated. Bus stations where runaway teenagers arrived with no resources or support systems. Homeless camps where people desperate for food and shelter could be lured with promises of employment and housing. Addiction treatment facilities where people in recovery could be targeted during their most vulnerable moments. The criminals had developed sophisticated methods for identifying and exploiting human vulnerability. They used social media to identify potential victims, conducted background checks to determine who was most likely to be missed if they disappeared, and maintained detailed profiles of the people they targeted for exploitation. Sarah realized that the trafficking network was essentially farming human beings, cultivating vulnerability and harvesting people whose disappearance wouldn't generate significant law enforcement attention. They were particularly effective at targeting people who were estranged from their families, had criminal records that made them reluctant to seek help from police, or were in the country illegally and feared deportation more than exploitation. But what disturbed Sarah most was the realization that this level of criminal sophistication couldn't exist without significant protection from law enforcement and other officials. The network's ability to operate across multiple jurisdictions, avoid detection despite extensive illegal activities, and continue operating even after major arrests suggested corruption that extended far beyond Detective Collins. Sarah began expanding her investigation to include other law enforcement personnel who had access to trafficking-related intelligence. She identified several officers and civilian employees who had access to operational information and began monitoring their activities for signs of suspicious behavior. What she discovered was a web of corruption that included not just police officers but also court personnel, social service workers, and immigration officials. The trafficking network had systematically compromised people in positions of authority who could protect their operations and eliminate threats to their continued profitability. Sarah realized that she was investigating not just human trafficking, but a comprehensive criminal conspiracy that had infected multiple levels of government and law enforcement. The scope of the corruption was so extensive that attempting to work within normal channels could result in her investigation being compromised before it could produce results. She made the difficult decision to contact federal authorities directly, bypassing her own department's chain of command and reporting what she had discovered to the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. Sarah understood that this decision would likely end her career with the local police department, but she also knew that the victims of trafficking deserved justice even if it came at personal cost to herself. The federal investigation that resulted from Sarah's intelligence took 18 months to complete and ultimately led to the arrest of 47 individuals, including 12 law enforcement personnel, 6 court employees, and multiple officials from various government agencies. The scope of the corruption was even more extensive than Sarah had suspected, involving a network that had been operating for over a decade and had generated millions of dollars in illegal profits. Detective Collins was arrested at his home on a Tuesday morning, charged with conspiracy, bribery, and human trafficking violations that could result in life imprisonment. The evidence against him included the photographs Sarah had taken during her surveillance, financial records showing unexplained income, and testimony from trafficking victims who identified him as someone who had protected their captors. But Collins' arrest also marked the beginning of a difficult period for Sarah. Although her role in exposing the corruption was kept confidential during the investigation, word eventually spread through the department that she had been the source of information that led to federal charges against her colleagues. Sarah found herself isolated within the department, viewed with suspicion by officers who wondered if she was investigating them as well. Some colleagues supported her actions and recognized the courage required to expose corruption, but others saw her as a traitor who had violated the unwritten code of loyalty that was supposed to protect police officers from outside scrutiny. The stress of the investigation and its aftermath began affecting Sarah's health and personal life. She struggled with insomnia, anxiety, and depression as she dealt with death threats from unknown sources and the knowledge that some of her colleagues viewed her as an enemy rather than a fellow officer committed to justice. Sarah requested a transfer to a different shift and patrol sector, hoping to escape the hostility and suspicion that made her graveyard shift work increasingly difficult. But she soon realized that her reputation had spread throughout the department, and there was no assignment that would allow her to escape the consequences of her decision to expose corruption. After 24 years of law enforcement service, including 12 years working graveyard shifts, Sarah made the decision to retire early and pursue a career in private investigation and victim advocacy. She felt that she could better serve trafficking victims and other vulnerable populations by working outside the law enforcement system that had proven susceptible to corruption and resistant to reform. Sarah established a private investigation firm that specialized in human trafficking cases, working with federal agencies, international organizations, and victim advocacy groups to identify and disrupt criminal networks. Her law enforcement experience and understanding of police procedures made her particularly effective at investigations that required coordination with multiple agencies. But she never forgot the lessons learned during her graveyard shift years, particularly the knowledge that evil often hid behind ordinary facades, and that the most important investigations sometimes began with routine calls that seemed no different from hundreds of others. Sarah's work as a private investigator led to the identification and rescue of over 300 trafficking victims over the 5 years following her retirement from police work. She developed training programs for law enforcement agencies around the world, helping officers recognize the subtle indicators of human trafficking and respond effectively when they encountered victims. Miguel Santos, the trafficking survivor who had become an advocate for other victims, worked closely with Sarah on several cases and training programs. Their partnership demonstrated the importance of cooperation between law enforcement and community members in addressing complex criminal networks. Officer Kowalski, Miguel said during one of their joint presentations to law enforcement personnel, showed me that there are police officers who will risk everything to protect people like us. But she also showed me that sometimes the system itself is the problem, and that real change requires people who are willing to challenge corrupt institutions even when it costs them personally. Sarah's story became a case study in police academies and training programs, illustrating both the importance of officer integrity and the personal costs that sometimes accompanied ethical decision-making in law enforcement. Her experience demonstrated that fighting corruption and protecting victims sometimes required sacrifices that went far beyond the dangers typically associated with police work. The trafficking network that had operated in her patrol sector was ultimately dismantled, but Sarah knew that similar operations existed in cities around the world. The demand for forced labor and sexual services created markets that criminal organizations would always seek to fill, and the vulnerability of certain populations provided a steady supply of potential victims. But Sarah also learned that individual officers could make a significant difference by remaining vigilant, documenting suspicious activities, and having the courage to act on their observations even when doing so was personally difficult or professionally dangerous. Her experience during the graveyard shift had taught her that the darkest hours before dawn were when both the worst and best of human nature revealed themselves. Predators emerged from the shadows to exploit the vulnerable, but dedicated individuals also worked tirelessly to protect the innocent and fight for justice, even at great personal cost. The Riverside Motel rescue had been the beginning of a journey that ultimately led Sarah to understand that fighting human trafficking required more than just arresting criminals and rescuing victims. It required addressing the corruption that protected criminal networks, the social conditions that created vulnerability, and the systemic failures that allowed modern slavery to flourish in supposedly free societies. Sarah continued her work as a private investigator and victim advocate, knowing that every person she helped rescue represented not just an individual success, but a victory against the forces that sought to reduce human beings to mere property. The graveyard shift had taught her that someone had to stand watch during the dark hours when evil thought it could operate without consequence. Now, even in retirement from law enforcement, she continued standing that watch, serving as a guardian for people who had no other advocates and fighting battles that might never make headlines but were essential for preserving human dignity and freedom. The trafficking network that had controlled 17 people in 3 motel rooms had been just one tentacle of a much larger criminal enterprise, but its exposure had ultimately led to the dismantling of corruption networks and the rescue of hundreds of victims. Sarah's willingness to risk her career and personal safety to protect vulnerable people had created ripple effects that continued to save lives years after she had first responded to that suspicious activity call at the Riverside Motel. The graveyard shift continued without her, staffed by new officers who would face their own moral challenges and opportunities to make a difference in the lives of people who desperately needed protection. Sarah hoped that her story would inspire some of those officers to have the courage to act when they encountered situations that demanded more than routine police procedures. She understood that law enforcement would always attract both people who genuinely wanted to serve and protect communities and people who sought to exploit the power and authority that came with wearing a badge. The challenge was creating systems that supported the ethical officers while identifying and removing the corrupt ones before they could cause harm to the people they were supposed to protect. Sarah's experience had taught her that the most important police work often happened during routine patrols and seemingly ordinary calls, when officers had to make split-second decisions about how much effort to invest in situations that might or might not lead to significant cases. The willingness to look more closely when something seemed wrong, to document details that might seem insignificant, and to follow up on suspicions even when doing so required extra work was what separated truly effective officers from those who merely performed their duties adequately. The trafficking victims she had encountered during her graveyard shift years had taught her that evil was often banal and bureaucratic, rather than dramatically obvious. Human trafficking flourished not because of isolated acts of violence by clearly identifiable criminals, but because of systematic indifference to human suffering and institutional failures that allowed vulnerable people to disappear without anyone noticing or caring. But those same victims had also demonstrated the resilience of human beings and their capacity for recovery even after experiencing unimaginable trauma. The survivors who had rebuilt their lives, become advocates for others, and found ways to transform their suffering into sources of strength and purpose, proved that hope could survive even in the darkest circumstances. Sarah carried those lessons with her as she continued her work outside of law enforcement, knowing that the fight against human trafficking required sustained effort from many people over many years. The graveyard shift had been her training ground for understanding the scope of human cruelty and the importance of individual courage in confronting evil. But it had also prepared her for a lifetime of work protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. In the end, Sarah's story was about more than just human trafficking or police corruption. It was about the responsibility that came with witnessing injustice and having the power to do something about it. The graveyard shift had taught her that true heroism often required quiet courage rather than dramatic gestures, the willingness to do what was right even when no one was watching and even when the personal costs were high. The victims she had rescued, the corruption she had exposed, and the criminal networks she had helped dismantle were all part of a larger battle between those who viewed other human beings as commodities to be exploited, and those who believed that every person deserved dignity, freedom, and protection from predators. Sarah had chosen her side during those dark hours of the graveyard shift, when the city slept and monsters emerged from the shadows to hunt the vulnerable. She had learned that someone had to stand guard during those hours. Someone had to be willing to look into the darkness and confront what they found there, regardless of the personal consequences. That commitment to protecting the vulnerable had defined her law enforcement career and continued to guide her work as a private investigator and advocate. The graveyard shift had ended for her, but the mission it had taught her would continue for the rest of her life, to serve as a guardian against the forces that threatened human dignity and freedom, and to ensure that even in the darkest hours, there was someone watching who refused to let evil operate without opposition. Officer Marcus "Tank" Williams had been working the graveyard shift in the East Side District for 6 years, and he thought he'd seen everything the streets could throw at him. Drug deals gone wrong, domestic violence that turned deadly, gang initiations that left teenagers bleeding out in parking lots. It was all part of the job when you worked the night shift in the part of town that decent people avoided after dark. But nothing had prepared him for the war that erupted on his beat during the third week of September 2023. It started with intelligence reports that came down from the gang unit during roll call on a Tuesday night. Sergeant Rodriguez stood at the front of the briefing room, his weathered face grim as he addressed the skeleton crew of officers who worked the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift. "Listen up, people. We've got credible intelligence that the East Side Serpents and the Iron Wolves are about to go to war over territory in the warehouse district. Both gangs have been moving product through the abandoned industrial area for months, but apparently there's been some kind of dispute over distribution rights." Tank leaned back in his metal folding chair, coffee cup balanced on his knee. The warehouse district was part of his regular patrol route. 15 square blocks of abandoned factories, empty lots, and buildings that had been boarded up since the recession. It was perfect for illegal activity because there were no residents to call in complaints, no legitimate businesses to worry about, and plenty of places to hide when the police showed up. Intelligence suggests both gangs have been stockpiling weapons for the past 2 weeks, Rodriguez continued. "We're talking serious firepower here. Not just handguns and shotguns, but assault rifles, maybe even explosives. The gang unit has been trying to get informants inside both organizations, but so far we're flying blind." Officer Jennifer Hayes, Tank's usual partner, raised her hand. "Sarge, what's our response protocol if shooting starts?" Do we wait for SWAT or engage? Rodriguez's expression darkened. That depends on the situation. If civilians are in danger, we respond immediately. If it's gang members shooting each other in an empty warehouse, we establish a perimeter and wait for backup. I don't want any of you trying to be heroes and getting yourselves killed over drug dealers settling scores. Tank understood the logic, but it still bothered him. The warehouse district might be abandoned, but it was still part of his beat. Those empty buildings and vacant lots were his responsibility, and the idea of letting gang members turn them into a war zone didn't sit well with him. After the briefing, Tank and Hayes loaded their gear into Unit 47 and headed out into the September night. The temperature had finally started dropping from the oppressive heat of summer, but the air still hung thick and humid over the empty streets. At 11:30 p.m., most of the legitimate businesses were closed, leaving only the 24-hour gas stations, all-night diners, and the people who made their living in the shadows. "You think this gang war thing is for real?" Hayes asked as they cruised down Morrison Avenue toward their patrol sector. "Or is it just intelligence blowing smoke like usual?" Tank had been partnered with Hayes for 2 years, and he trusted her instincts. She was a 5-year veteran who had worked her way up from patrol to detective and back to patrol by choice. She preferred the unpredictability of street work to the paperwork and politics of investigative units. "I think it's real," Tank replied, adjusting his duty belt. "I've been seeing more activity in the warehouse district over the past month. More cars moving through at night, more lights in buildings that are supposed to be empty. Something's building up over there." They drove in comfortable silence through the residential areas on the edge of their sector. Modest houses with small yards, working-class families who kept their doors locked and their porch lights on. These were the people Tank and Hayes were really protecting, the ones who couldn't afford to move to safer neighborhoods, but deserved to sleep peacefully without worrying about bullets flying through their windows. At 12:47 a.m., their radio crackled with the first call of the night. "All units, we have reports of gunfire in the vicinity of Warehouse Row and Industrial Drive. Multiple shots fired, unknown number of shooters. Units 23, 31, and 47 respond Code 2. Tank felt his pulse quicken as he hit the emergency lights and headed toward the warehouse district. Code 2 meant respond quickly but without sirens. They wanted to get there fast, but didn't want to announce their arrival to whoever was doing the shooting. "Here we go," Hayes muttered, checking her weapon and adjusting her radio. "Remember what Rodriguez said, we establish a perimeter and wait for backup unless civilians are in immediate danger." The warehouse district looked different at night than it did during the day. What appeared to be merely abandoned and neglected in daylight became something more sinister after dark. Shadows pooled between buildings like spilled ink, and the few functioning streetlights created more concealment than illumination. Tank had always felt like he was driving through a post-apocalyptic wasteland when he patrolled this area. They approached from the east, coming down Industrial Drive with their headlights off and emergency lights dimmed. Tank could see muzzle flashes coming from 2 different buildings about 3 blocks apart, one from what used to be a textile factory, the other from a warehouse that had once housed auto parts. "Jesus," Hayes whispered. "That's not handgun fire, those are rifles." She was right. Tank could hear the distinctive crack of high-powered weapons echoing off the empty buildings. This wasn't a simple drug deal gone wrong or a dispute over territory boundaries. This was a full-scale firefight with military-grade weapons. Tank keyed his radio. "Dispatch, Unit 47 is on scene at Industrial Drive and Warehouse Row. We have confirmed gunfire from multiple locations. Appears to be rifle fire. Requesting SWAT response and additional backup units." "Copy, Unit 47. SWAT is en route. ETA 15 minutes. Units 23 and 31 are 2 minutes out. Establish perimeter and do not engage unless civilians are in immediate danger. Tank parked their cruiser behind an abandoned delivery truck that provided cover while giving them a good view of both buildings where the shooting was coming from. Hayes got on the radio to coordinate with the other responding units while Tank used binoculars to assess the situation. What he saw made his blood run cold. Both buildings were lit up like Christmas trees with muzzle flashes. Tank could see figures moving on rooftops, in windows, behind concrete barriers that had been set up in advance. This wasn't a spontaneous shootout. It was a carefully planned battle with prepared positions and coordinated fire. "Hayes, look at this," Tank said, handing her the binoculars. "Those concrete barriers, the positioning of the shooters, this was planned. Both sides knew this was coming and prepared for it." Hayes studied the scene through the binoculars, her face growing pale in the dim light from their radio display. "Tank, those aren't just gang members. Look at how they're moving, how they're coordinating their fire. Some of these guys have military training." She was right. Gang shootouts were usually chaotic affairs with poor marksmanship and wasted ammunition. What they were watching was disciplined, organized, tactical. Both sides were using covering fire, coordinated movement, and strategic positioning that suggested professional training. Units 23 and 31 arrived within minutes, taking positions on the north and south sides of the conflict zone. The 4 patrol officers established a loose perimeter around the 2 buildings, but they were vastly outgunned and outnumbered by whatever was happening inside. Tank's radio crackled with Sergeant Rodriguez's voice. "All units on scene. This is Rodriguez. I'm en route with additional units and the gang task force. Do not, repeat, do not engage the shooters. Establish containment and wait for SWAT." But even as Rodriguez was giving the order, Tank could see the situation escalating. More muzzle flashes were appearing in both buildings, indicating that reinforcements were arriving for both sides. The volume of fire was increasing, and Tank could hear bullets ricocheting off the concrete and steel structures. "Unit 47, this is Unit 23, came a voice over the radio. "I've got movement in the building to my north. Looks like one side is trying to flank the other. They're moving toward the residential area." Tank felt his stomach drop. If the fighting moved out of the industrial district and into the neighborhoods where families lived, the rules of engagement would change completely. They couldn't just sit back and wait for SWAT if civilians were in danger. Hayes was already moving toward the driver's seat. "Come on, Tank. We need to get between them and the residential area. If this spreads beyond the warehouse district, people are going to die." Tank climbed into the passenger seat as Hayes started the engine. They drove north along Industrial Drive, parallel to the fighting, but staying out of the direct line of fire. Tank could see groups of armed figures moving between buildings, using the abandoned vehicles and industrial equipment for cover. "There." Hayes pointed toward a gap between 2 warehouses. "They're moving through that alley toward Morrison Avenue. If they get to Morrison, they'll be in the residential area." Tank grabbed his radio. "All units, Unit 47 has visual on approximately 8 armed subjects moving north toward Morrison Avenue. They appear to be flanking the main engagement and heading toward the residential district." Rodriguez's voice crackled back immediately. "Unit 47, intercept and establish a barrier at Morrison and Industrial. Do not engage unless fired upon. Keep them contained in the industrial area." Hayes drove to the intersection and positioned their cruiser sideways across Morrison Avenue, creating a roadblock that would force the armed figures to either go around them or confront them directly. Tank got out and took position behind the engine block, his rifle ready but pointed at the ground. They didn't have to wait long. 8 men in dark clothing emerged from the alley between the warehouses, all carrying assault rifles and moving with the practiced coordination Tank had noticed earlier. They stopped when they saw the police cruiser blocking their path, and Tank could see them discussing their options in low voices. Tank keyed his radio and spoke loudly enough for the armed men to hear. "This is the police. The area beyond this point is residential. You need to turn around and go back the way you came." One of the men, apparently the leader, stepped forward. He was tall and lean, wearing military-style fatigues and carrying an AK-47 variant. Tank could see military tattoos on his arms and the kind of confident posture that came from combat experience. "Officer," the man called out, his voice calm and professional. "We don't have any quarrel with you. We're just trying to get out of the area. Our vehicles are parked on Morrison Avenue." Tank kept his rifle ready but maintained a non-aggressive posture. "I understand that, but you're heavily armed and there's been gunfire in the area. I can't let you proceed into a residential neighborhood with those weapons." The man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. "Officer, with all due respect, you're outnumbered 8-2. We're not looking for trouble with law enforcement, but we're not going to be detained either. We have business to finish." Hayes had positioned herself behind the rear of the cruiser, her own rifle ready, and her radio keyed to broadcast everything that was happening to the other units. Tank could hear in his earpiece that SWAT was still 10 minutes out, and the other patrol units were tied up maintaining their perimeter around the main firefight. "What business is that?" Tank asked, trying to keep the conversation going while backup arrived. The man's expression hardened. The kind of business that started when the Iron Wolves decided they could muscle in on Serpent territory without consequences. The kind of business that ends when everyone understands the boundaries again. Tank realized he was talking to a leader of the East Side Serpents, probably someone high enough in the organization to make strategic decisions about territory and conflicts. This wasn't just a gang member following orders. This was someone who had planned and authorized the firefight that was still raging 3 blocks away. "Look," Tank said, trying to find common ground, "I get that you have issues to resolve, but innocent people live in the neighborhoods behind me, families with kids. Whatever your business is, it doesn't have to involve them." The Serpent leader nodded slowly. "You're right about that, officer. Families and kids shouldn't be involved in this. But the Iron Wolves didn't feel that way when they started selling their poison in our neighborhood playgrounds. They didn't care about families when they recruited kids to run their drugs." Tank could hear the genuine anger in the man's voice, and it complicated his understanding of the situation. Gang conflicts weren't always just about money and territory. Sometimes they were about protecting communities from outside threats, even if the protection came from people who were themselves criminals. "So, what's the solution here?" Tank asked. "How does this end without more people getting hurt?" The Serpent leader looked back at his men, then at the ongoing firefight in the distance. The sound of gunfire had decreased significantly, suggesting that one side or the other was running low on ammunition or personnel. "It ends when the Wolves understand that East Side belongs to the Serpents, when they pack up their operation and take it back to their own territory on the North Side, when they stop recruiting our kids and selling their drugs in our neighborhoods." Hayes's voice came through Tank's earpiece. "SWAT is 5 minutes out. Keep them talking." Tank nodded almost imperceptibly, then continued his conversation with the Serpent leader. What if there was another way to resolve this? What if we could set up a meeting between the leadership of both gangs, with police mediation? Work out territorial boundaries without more shooting? The man laughed, but it was a bitter sound without humor. "Officer, with all due respect, the police haven't done much to protect our neighborhood from the Iron Wolves. We've reported their dealers, their recruitment of minors, their violence against our people. Your department's response has been to arrest a few low-level dealers and call it a success." Tank had to admit the man had a point. Gang enforcement was always reactive rather than proactive, focused on making arrests after crimes had been committed, rather than preventing the crimes in the first place. The community policing initiatives that might have addressed the root causes of gang conflicts had been cut from the budget years ago. But this kind of violence makes things worse for everyone, Tank argued. When you start a war like this, innocent people get caught in the crossfire. Kids get killed by stray bullets. Families get displaced. The community suffers more than the people you're fighting. The serpent leader's expression softened slightly. You think we don't know that? You think we wanted this? We tried to handle this diplomatically first. We reached out to the Iron Wolves, tried to negotiate boundaries, tried to work out a peaceful solution. They responded by killing 3 of our people and burning down 2 of our legitimate businesses. Tank felt the complexity of the situation settling over him like a weight. These weren't just criminals fighting over drug profits. They were people who saw themselves as protecting their community from outside aggression. The methods were illegal and dangerous, but the motivations were more complicated than simple greed or territorial ambition. The sound of gunfire from the warehouses had stopped completely, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the distant wail of sirens as more police units converged on the area. Tank could see smoke rising from both buildings, and the acrid smell of gunpowder was drifting across the intersection. "Sounds like your people finished their business," Tank observed. The serpent leader listened for a moment, then keyed a radio of his own. A brief conversation in Spanish followed. Then he looked back at Tank. "The warehouse phase is over. The Iron Wolves are pulling out, at least for now. But this isn't finished, officer. They'll regroup, bring in more people, try to hit us somewhere else. This was just the opening round." Hayes' voice crackled through Tank's earpiece. "SWAT is on scene, moving into position behind us. Tank, keep them talking for another 2 minutes." Tank could see the SWAT officers taking positions in the shadows behind their patrol car, but the serpent leader and his men hadn't noticed yet. Tank had to keep them focused forward while the tactical team got into position. "What would it take to end this permanently?" Tank asked. "Not just this battle, but the whole conflict?" The serpent leader considered the question seriously. "The Iron Wolves would have to acknowledge that East Side is serpent territory and pull their operation out completely. They'd have to pay reparations for the businesses they destroyed and the people they killed. And they'd have to guarantee that they won't recruit any more kids from our neighborhood. And if they agreed to those terms, then we could have peace. But they won't agree, officer. They've invested too much in establishing their presence here, and their leadership would see backing down as weakness. So this will continue until one side is completely defeated or driven out." Tank could see the SWAT officers giving hand signals indicating they were ready to move. He had to make a decision. Allow the tactical team to arrest the serpent leader and his men, potentially escalating the conflict, or try to negotiate a peaceful resolution that might prevent future violence. "What if I could guarantee that your concerns about Iron Wolf activities in East Side would be taken seriously?" Tank offered. "What if we could set up a task force specifically focused on their drug dealing and recruitment of minors?" The serpent leader studied Tank's face in the dim light. "You're stalling, officer. I can see your SWAT team moving into position behind you. You're trying to keep us talking until they can surround us." Tank felt his heart rate spike, but he kept his voice calm. "I'm trying to find a solution that doesn't involve more people getting hurt. Your people, my people, or the families who live in this neighborhood. I appreciate that, officer, I really do. But we both know how this has to end. You have a job to do, and so do we." The serpent leader raised his hand, and his 7 men immediately spread out into tactical positions, using the abandoned vehicles and concrete barriers for cover. Tank could see that they were professionals, moving with the kind of coordination that suggested extensive training and experience. "This doesn't have to happen," Tank called out. "We can still find another way." "Officer," the serpent leader replied, his voice carrying clearly across the intersection. "Sometimes there is no other way. Sometimes you have to fight for what's yours, even when you know the cost is going to be high." Tank heard the SWAT commander's voice in his earpiece. "All units, we have the suspects surrounded. On my mark, we move. Tank, Hayes, get down and stay down." But before the SWAT team could move, the serpent leader made an unexpected decision. Instead of preparing for a firefight with police, he lowered his weapon and called out to his men in Spanish. One by one, they laid down their rifles and raised their hands. "Officer," the serpent leader said to Tank, "we're going to surrender, but I want you to remember this conversation. Remember that we tried to handle this peacefully first, and remember what happens to this neighborhood after we're arrested." Tank stood up from behind the police cruiser, his own weapon lowered but ready. "Why are you surrendering?" The man smiled, and this time it was genuine. "Because you're right about the families and kids, because this neighborhood has suffered enough, and because sometimes the best way to protect your people is to take responsibility for your actions." The SWAT team moved in quickly, professionally zip-tying the 8 serpent members and searching them for additional weapons. Tank watched as the leader was secured, noting that the man maintained his dignity even in defeat. As the serpent leader was being loaded into a transport van, he looked directly at Tank. "Officer, my name is Carlos Mendez. When this neighborhood goes to hell because the Iron Wolves have no opposition, remember that we tried to prevent it." Tank nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He was beginning to understand that the situation was far more complex than gang members fighting over drug territory. These were people fighting to protect their community in the only way they knew how, using illegal methods because legal ones had failed them. The aftermath of the warehouse firefight revealed the scope of the conflict. The textile factory had been heavily damaged by gunfire and small explosives, with bullet holes in every wall, and several small fires that had been extinguished by the time the fire department arrived. The auto parts warehouse was in similar condition, looking more like a war zone than an abandoned building. 3 Iron Wolf members were found dead in the warehouse, with 2 more critically wounded and transported to the hospital under police guard. No serpent casualties were discovered, suggesting that they had been better prepared and positioned for the firefight. The weapons recovered from both locations were staggering in quantity and quality. Along with the expected handguns and shotguns, investigators found assault rifles, grenades, body armor, and night vision equipment. This had been planned as a military-style operation, not a spontaneous gang conflict. Tank and Hayes spent the rest of their shift processing evidence and writing reports, but Tank couldn't stop thinking about his conversation with Carlos Mendez. The serpent leader had spoken about protecting his community, about trying diplomatic solutions first, about the failure of conventional law enforcement to address the root causes of gang conflicts. Over the following weeks, Tank began paying closer attention to the East Side neighborhood. He drove through the residential areas more frequently, talked to more residents, tried to understand the community dynamics that had led to the warehouse firefight. What he learned disturbed him. The Iron Wolves had indeed been expanding their territory into East Side, but their methods were more aggressive and violent than typical gang operations. They were recruiting children as young as 12 to run drugs, threatening families who refused to cooperate, and using violence against anyone who challenged their presence. The East Side Serpents, despite being a criminal organization, had historically operated more like a neighborhood protection group. They dealt drugs, but they didn't recruit children. They used violence, but mainly against other criminals who threatened their territory. They extorted local businesses, but they also protected those businesses from outside threats. Tank realized that the warehouse firefight hadn't been a simple territorial dispute. It had been a community defending itself against an invasion, using the only resources and methods available to them. But, without the Serpent leadership, the neighborhood began to deteriorate rapidly. Iron Wolf dealers appeared on street corners that had been relatively safe. Children were approached with recruitment offers that their parents couldn't protect them from. Businesses that had operated peacefully for years began reporting extortion attempts and vandalism. Tank tried to address these problems through conventional police methods, but the department's resources were limited, and the problems were too widespread for patrol officers to handle effectively. The gang unit was focused on making arrests rather than preventing crime, and the community policing programs that might have helped had been eliminated due to budget cuts. 3 weeks after the warehouse firefight, Tank responded to a call that would haunt him for the rest of his career. It was 2:30 a.m. on a Thursday night when dispatch sent him to a shooting on Maple Street, in the heart of the residential area he'd been trying to protect. A 9-year-old girl named Sophia Reyes had been shot while sleeping in her bedroom when gunfire erupted between Iron Wolf dealers and a rival group trying to establish their own presence in the power, vacuum left by the Serpent arrests. Tank arrived at the scene to find paramedics working desperately on a small girl who had been hit by a stray bullet that came through her bedroom window. Her parents were hysterical, her siblings were traumatized, and the neighborhood was in chaos as residents tried to understand how their quiet street had become a war zone. Sophia died at the hospital 2 hours later. Tank stood in the hospital corridor, still in his uniform, watching Sophia's family grieve for a little girl who had been killed because of a gang conflict she had no part in. He thought about his conversation with Carlos Mendez, about the Serpent leader's warnings that the neighborhood would suffer without organized opposition to the Iron Wolves. The funeral was held on a Saturday morning, and Tank attended in civilian clothes. The church was packed with residents of the East Side neighborhood, many of whom Tank recognized from his patrols. After the service, an elderly woman named Mrs. Rodriguez approached him. "Officer Williams," she said, her voice shaking with grief and anger. "You arrested Carlos Mendez and his people. You said it would make us safer. But now my granddaughter is dead, and there are drug dealers on every corner. How is this better?" Tank had no answer for her. The conventional law enforcement response to gang violence had been to arrest the gang members, but that approach had created a power vacuum that more violent groups had filled. The community was worse off than before, and a little girl was dead because of it. He began researching alternative approaches to gang violence, looking for examples of communities that had successfully addressed these problems without creating worse situations. What he found challenged everything he thought he knew about effective policing. In some cities, police departments had worked with established gangs to minimize violence and protect civilians, even while continuing to arrest gang members for specific crimes. The approach was controversial and legally complex, but it had resulted in significant reductions in innocent casualties and community violence. Other departments had focused on addressing the root causes of gang membership: poverty, lack of educational opportunities, absence of legitimate economic alternatives. These programs required significant resources and community partnerships, but they had shown promise in preventing gang recruitment and reducing overall crime rates. Tank realized that the warehouse firefight had been a symptom of deeper problems that conventional policing couldn't address. The East Side Serpents and Iron Wolves weren't just criminal organizations. They were responses to community needs that legitimate institutions had failed to meet. But implementing alternative approaches would require changes in department policy, community support, and political will that seemed unlikely in the current environment. Tank was just a patrol officer working the graveyard shift. he didn't have the authority or influence to change how the entire system approached gang violence. 6 months after Sofia Reyes's death, Tank made a decision that would end his law enforcement career. He was working his regular graveyard shift patrol when he received intelligence that the Iron Wolves were planning a major expansion of their territory, including the recruitment of elementary school children to act as lookouts and runners. The intelligence came from a reliable source within the community, but it wasn't specific enough for the department to take preventive action. Tank knew that by the time conventional law enforcement could respond, children would already be recruited and put in danger. Families would be threatened, and the community would suffer more violence and instability. He also knew that Carlos Mendez and several other Serpent leaders were scheduled to be released from jail the following month after serving reduced sentences in exchange for information about Iron Wolf activities. They would return to a neighborhood that had been destroyed in their absence, and their response would likely be violent and destabilizing. Tank made a decision that violated every rule of professional policing, but aligned with his understanding of what the community needed. He arranged a meeting between Carlos Mendez and the Iron Wolf leadership, using his position as a police officer to facilitate communication between the two gangs. The meeting took place in a neutral location, an abandoned church that had once served the East Side community, with the Tank serving as an unofficial mediator. The negotiation was tense and complex, with both sides carrying weapons and prepared for violence if talks broke down. But Tank's presence as a police officer and his reputation for fairness in the community gave the process enough legitimacy for both sides to engage seriously. The agreement they reached was imperfect and legally questionable, but it addressed both gangs agreed to establish mechanisms for resolving future disputes without involving civilians, and to contribute financially to community programs that would provide alternatives to gang membership for young people. Tank knew that facilitating this agreement would end his career if discovered, but he also knew that it was the only way to prevent more children like Sofia Reyes from being killed in gang violence. The agreement held for almost 2 years, during which time civilian casualties from gang violence in the East Side neighborhood dropped to nearly zero. Children were safer, families felt more secure, and local businesses began to recover from years of instability. But Tank's role in facilitating the agreement was eventually discovered during an internal affairs investigation into corruption allegations against another officer. The investigation revealed that Tank had used his police radio and vehicle to coordinate meetings between gang leaders, had shared intelligence about planned law enforcement operations, and had essentially functioned as a liaison between criminal organizations. Tank was fired from the police department and faced potential criminal charges for corruption and obstruction of justice. But the community he had served rallied to his defense, with residents testifying about the improved safety and stability that had resulted from his actions. The case became a flashpoint for debates about police effectiveness, community policing, and the role of law enforcement in addressing complex social problems. Some saw Tank as a corrupt cop who had betrayed his oath and collaborated with criminals. Others saw him as an officer who had found an innovative solution to an intractable problem, and had been willing to sacrifice his career to protect innocent people. Carlos Mendez, who had been released from prison and had honored the agreement Tank had facilitated, testified on Tank's behalf during the criminal proceedings. Officer Williams did something that no other police officer had ever done, Mendez told the court. He listened to our community, understood our problems, and helped us find a solution that protected our children. He didn't just arrest people and leave. He took responsibility for the consequences of his actions. Tank was ultimately sentenced to 2 years of probation and community service, avoiding prison time but permanently barred from law enforcement. He used his knowledge of gang dynamics and community policing to become a consultant for other cities struggling with similar problems. helping to develop programs that addressed gang violence through community engagement rather than purely punitive measures. The East Side neighborhood continued to benefit from the informal agreement between the Serpents and Iron Wolves, with both gangs eventually transitioning some of their operations into legitimate businesses with support from community development programs. The warehouse district was redeveloped into affordable housing and small business incubators, transforming the site of the original firefight into a symbol of community renewal. But Tank never forgot the lessons learned during that September night when gang warfare erupted on his beat. He learned that conventional policing approaches often treated symptoms rather than causes, that communities sometimes had to protect themselves when official institutions failed them, and that the most effective solutions to complex problems sometimes required breaking rules and accepting personal consequences. The graveyard shift continued without him, staffed by officers who followed protocol and avoided the kind of controversial decisions that had ended his career. But Tank knew that somewhere in the city, other officers were facing similar choices between following rules and protecting communities, between maintaining professional distance and accepting personal responsibility for the consequences of their actions. In the end, Tank's story became a cautionary tale for some and an inspiration for others, a reminder that police work sometimes required moral courage as well as physical bravery, and that protecting and serving communities sometimes meant challenging the very systems that were supposed to provide that protection. The warehouse firefight had lasted only 3 hours, but its consequences reverberated through the East Side community for years afterward. It demonstrated the complexity of gang violence, the limitations of conventional law enforcement responses, and the difficult choices that officers sometimes faced when trying to serve communities that conventional methods had failed to protect. Whether Tank Williams was a hero or a criminal depended on perspective, but there was no question that his actions had saved lives and transformed a community. In the unforgiving world of graveyard shift policing, sometimes that was the best anyone could hope for.